Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dive investigations into the mysteries that keep us wondering. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Now let's get into something that might change how you think about what's beneath our feet. There's a single frame of VHS footage that refuses to leave my mind. A middle-aged man standing at a podium in Denver. The year is 1995. His hands shake slightly as he holds the microphone, but not from nervousness. These are the tremors of someone whose nervous system has been fundamentally damaged, whose body carries the physical evidence of trauma that most people couldn't survive. Behind him, a grainy projection shows geological cross-sections of northern New Mexico, layers of sediment and rock with annotations in his own handwriting. He's talking about underground bases, about things he claims to have seen with his own eyes, about a firefight that supposedly happened 16 years earlier in tunnels that officially don't exist. His name was Phil Schneider. The quality of the tape is terrible, degraded by time and multiple duplications, but you can still see the surgical scars on his hands where fingers used to be. You can still hear the conviction in his voice when he describes the smell of the tunnels, the sound of weapons fire echoing through chambers carved from living rock, the bodies of colleagues who never made it back to the surface. 1 year after this lecture, he would be found dead in his apartment in Wilsonville, Oregon, a catheter hose wrapped around his neck so tightly that it took considerable force. The official ruling: suicide. His hands, the same hands that were missing multiple fingers, allegedly managed to strangle himself with enough pressure to crush his larynx. The people who knew him said Phil Schneider was many things, but he wasn't suicidal. He was angry. He was determined. He was convinced that the public deserved to know what their government was doing in the deep places of the earth. But in that lecture, in that single moment captured on deteriorating magnetic tape, he says something that cuts through decades of conspiracy noise like a scalpel through flesh. He leans into the microphone and his voice drops to almost a whisper, as if he's afraid of being overheard even in a public venue. They're still there, under Archuleta Mesa, still working, still waiting. The camera wobbles, someone in the audience coughs. Phil Schneider's hands grip the podium, and for just a moment you can see something in his eyes that transcends fear. It's certainty. The absolute knowledge of someone who has seen something they can never unsee. This is the story of what happens when you decide to find out if he was telling the truth. This is the story of what happens when you look for a door that was never meant to be found. This is the Dulce Protocol. The Man Who Never Came Back, June 1979. The high desert of northern New Mexico bakes under relentless sun that turns the landscape into something alien and unforgiving. Phil Schneider, a former Los Alamos explosives technician with 17 years of experience in underground construction, stands at the edge of what will become the most controversial claim of his life. According to his later testimony, delivered in conference rooms and small venues across America in the mid-90s, he's part of a construction crew drilling into the mesa near the small town of Dulce. They're building something deep, something that requires specialized knowledge of underground detonation and structural engineering in extreme conditions. The project is classified. The workers don't know what they're building, only that it's important enough to warrant the presence of armed military personnel and security protocols that seem excessive for a simple construction job. Schneider was good at his work. He'd helped build underground facilities before, part of the vast network of hardened structures the US government constructed during the Cold War. Deep command bunkers, missile silos, facilities designed to survive nuclear war. He knew rock composition, load-bearing calculations, the precise amount of explosive needed to carve chambers from solid stone without causing catastrophic collapse. But on this particular day in June, something goes wrong. The drill bit, boring through layers of sedimentary rock and volcanic tuff, suddenly drops into empty space. The change in resistance is immediate and unmistakable. They've broken through into a cavity, a void that shouldn't exist according to the geological surveys. The crew pulls the bit back, and air rushes out of the hole. Not the stale, dead air of a sealed pocket, but moving air. Air that's been somewhere. According to Schneider's account, what happens next changes everything. They widen the hole, prepare to investigate. Standard procedure dictates caution, gas detection, structural assessment. But before they can complete their safety protocols, something comes through from the other side. The official story, if there even is one, has been buried under layers of classification and deliberate confusion. Government documents related to the Dulce construction project from 1979 are still sealed, their very existence neither confirmed nor denied. But Schneider would spend the last years of his life telling anyone who would listen about what happened next. About the tunnel they found, already excavated, showing evidence of construction methods that didn't match any human engineering he recognised. About the entities they encountered, beings, that didn't respond to verbal commands or warning shots the way humans would. About the firefight that erupted when security forces arrived and attempted to assert control. About the beams of light that cut through rock and flesh with equal ease. About the screaming that echoed through chambers that went deeper than their maps suggested possible. Schneider claimed that 67 people died that day. Military personnel, construction workers, security contractors. He said he survived only because a Green Beret allegedly threw him away from one of the directed energy weapons the entities were using, taking the fatal blast himself. Schneider's hands told their own story. Missing fingers, burned scars. Nerve damage so extensive that he struggled with fine motor control for the rest of his life. His medical records, the ones he shared publicly, documented radiation exposure inconsistent with any civilian source. His disability claim cited injuries sustained in the line of duty during classified operations, language carefully chosen to reveal nothing while confirming something happened. Fast forward to 2021. Elias Ford sits in his cramped graduate student apartment in Los Angeles, the blue glow of his laptop screen illuminating stacks of research papers about government transparency, press freedom, and the limits of FOIA requests. Empty coffee cups form a small mountain on his desk. His thesis advisor's increasingly concerned emails sit unanswered in his inbox. His girlfriend stopped calling 3 weeks ago after one too many conversations that started with dinner plans and ended with theories about underground facilities. He's watching that Denver lecture for the 47th time, and he started keeping count because he's begun to notice things, small details, the way Schneider's left eye twitches when he mentions specific dates, the way he grips the podium when describing the entities, the way his voice breaks, genuinely breaks, when he talks about the men who didn't make it out. Elias isn't a conspiracy theorist. At least not the kind who sees patterns in pizza restaurant logos, or believes in shape-shifting reptilians running world governments. He's methodical, trained in verification and source analysis, taught to follow evidence wherever it leads, and to trust documentation over speculation. His undergraduate work in investigative journalism earned him awards. His professors called him unusually rigorous in his approach to research. But something about Schneider's testimony gnaws at him with the persistence of a splinter working its way deeper under the skin. It's not what the man says, it's how he says it. The specific details, the technical language that rings true to anyone who knows construction and engineering. The way he references real places, real agencies, real protocols. The way his voice cracks when he describes the smell of ozone and burnt flesh. A description so visceral and specific that it feels like sense memory rather than fabrication. People who lie tend to embellish. They add dramatic details, create heroic narratives, paint themselves as central figures in grand conspiracies. Schneider's account is almost clinically spare. He doesn't claim to understand what he encountered. He doesn't pretend to have special knowledge of alien civilizations or government conspiracies. He simply describes what he says he experienced. in the language of a construction worker who found something he wasn't supposed to find. And then there's the death. January 7th, 1996. Phil Schneider found dead in his apartment after being missing for several days. The autopsy report, publicly available, notes the catheter hose wrapped around his neck with enough force to crush the hyoid bone and thyroid cartilage. The medical examiner ruled it suicide, but Elias has read that autopsy report a dozen times, and the details bother him. Schneider's hands, already damaged and missing fingers, would have struggled to generate the force necessary for that kind of strangulation. The positioning of the ligature suggested pressure applied from behind and above, awkward for self-infliction. There were no drugs in his system, no alcohol, nothing to suggest impaired judgment or suicidal ideation. Friends and family insisted Schneider was preparing for more lectures. He had bookings scheduled. He was working on a presentation about government black budgets. He told multiple people he had more information to share, documents he was still organising. Then he was dead, and the narrative shifted from whistleblower to troubled man who took his own life. Elias makes a decision that will unravel his life, though he doesn't know it yet. He's going to find out what really happened at Dulce. He's going to treat this like a real investigation, following evidence, tracking down sources, building a case that can withstand scrutiny. He's going to assume Schneider was telling the truth and see where that assumption leads. It's 2 a.m. when he creates a new folder on his laptop, Dulce Protocol. Inside, he begins cataloguing everything he can find. Schneider's lectures, transcribed word for word. Geological surveys of the Archuleta Mesa region. Historical records of construction projects in northern New Mexico during the late 70s. News articles about cattle mutilations. Reports of UFO sightings. Missing person cases. The coffee goes cold as he works. Outside his window, Los Angeles sleeps. And somewhere in New Mexico, beneath a mesa that rises from high desert like a monument to secrets, machinery hums in tunnels that officially don't exist. Elias doesn't sleep that night. He's crossed a threshold, made a commitment to a path that will consume him. In the morning he'll start making calls. He'll reach out to witnesses, researchers, anyone who might remember the events of 1979. But for now, he watches the lecture one more time. Phil Schneider's damaged hands gripping the podium, his voice carrying the weight of truth that no one wants to hear. They're still there, under Archuleta Mesa, still working, still waiting. Waiting for what, Elias wonders, and more importantly, waiting for whom? Act 1. The history they don't talk about real-world origins. Every conspiracy theory has an origin point. A moment where documented reality blurs into speculation, where the solid ground of verifiable fact gives way to the quicksand of possibility. For Dulce, that moment begins not with a dramatic revelation, but with routine police work in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. October 1967. The town of Dulce, population roughly 2,000, sits in the high country of northern New Mexico like a secret the landscape is trying to keep. It's Jicarilla Apache Reservation land, a place of stunning vistas and deep cultural significance, where the modern world sits uncomfortably alongside traditions that stretch back centuries. The town itself is small, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the arrival of strangers is noticed and remembered. New Mexico State Police records from that October tell a story that doesn't fit comfortably into official narratives. Multiple officers, working different shifts, responding to different calls, all report the same thing. Lights in the sky near Archuleta Mesa, not distant aircraft lights or stars misidentified by unreliable witnesses. These are objects moving in patterns that violate basic physics as the officers understand it. Patrolman James Bustamante files a report on October 14th, describing an object that appeared stationary for 17 minutes before accelerating to impossible speed with no visible means of propulsion. His report is detailed, clinical, the work of a professional trying to document something that challenges his understanding of reality. He notes wind conditions, visibility, the presence of his partner as a corroborating witness. He sketches the object's flight path and estimates its size relative to known landmarks. 3 days later, Sergeant Maria Sanchez reports a similar sighting from a different location, then Officer Thomas Whitehorse, then others. The reports accumulate in files that will sit in archives for decades, neither investigated nor explained, simply recorded and filed away under classifications that ensure they won't be casually discovered. These aren't anonymous reports from unreliable witnesses claiming they were abducted or probed. These are sworn law enforcement officials filing paperwork that could affect their careers and credibility, documenting something they can't explain but can't deny they witnessed. The sightings continue sporadically over the next several years. Sometimes months pass between reports. Sometimes multiple sightings occur within days. The pattern is inconsistent enough to resist easy explanation, but persistent enough to establish that something unusual is happening in the airspace around Archuleta Mesa. Then comes the cattle mutilation wave, and the strangeness takes on a darker character. Between 1975 and 1979, ranchers across northern New Mexico report something that transforms the region from mysterious to actively frightening. Cattle found dead in fields, their bodies surgically altered with precision that baffles veterinarians and law enforcement alike. The cases share disturbing commonalities that suggest systematic rather than random events. The animals are found drained of blood, their bodies showing no signs of bloating or decomposition that would normally occur within hours of death. Organs are removed through incisions so clean they appear to be made with surgical instruments far more precise than any farmer or veterinarian in the region possesses. Eyes excised with circular cuts, tongues removed through the jaw, reproductive organs extracted with what forensic veterinarians describe as laser-like precision. No blood pools around the bodies, no tracks approach or leave the carcasses, no signs of predation, no evidence of scavengers, just the bodies, arranged in ways that seem almost deliberate, as if left as messages or warnings. Local veterinarian Thomas Chen examines dozens of these animals between 1976 and 79. His reports, preserved in county records and later obtained through FYA requests, note details that defy conventional explanation. Hemoglobin levels in remaining tissue suggest rapid exsanguination, but there's no blood at the scene. Incision edges show heat damage at the cellular level, consistent with cauterization by directed energy rather than cutting by blade. In several cases, bones appear to have been softened or partially dissolved to allow organ removal through impossibly small openings. These are not predator kills, Chen writes in a report dated March 1978. These are not the work of cultists or pranksters. The precision and methodology suggest technology and knowledge beyond what any civilian operation would possess. I have no explanation that satisfies the evidence. In March of 1979, the phenomenon reaches a crescendo. Local rancher Manuel Gomez discovers 17 mutilated cattle on his property over a span of 8 days. The animals represent a significant portion of his herd, thousands of dollars in losses that insurance refuses to cover, because no one can determine the cause of death. Gomez is the third generation of his family to work this land. He knows cattle. He knows predators. He knows what natural death looks like. What he finds in his fields is something else entirely. He calls the sheriff. He calls the state police. He calls federal authorities. A team from the FBI's Albuquerque field office arrives to investigate, part of a broader multi-state effort to understand the cattle mutilation phenomenon that's been terrorizing ranchers across the Southwest. The FBI reports, later released through FOI gay requests after decades of classification, make for disturbing reading. Special agents document incision patterns, tissue samples, the complete absence of forensic evidence that would normally accompany either human or animal predation. They interview ranchers, veterinarians, local law enforcement. They consult with pathologists and forensic specialists. Their conclusions are carefully worded, written in the bureaucratic language designed to convey information without making inflammatory statements. But one phrase appears 17 times across multiple reports, always in quotes, as if the agents writing the reports want to distance themselves from the implications, cutting instruments of unknown origin. Unknown origin. Not advanced surgical tools, not specialised equipment. Unknown origin, as if the FBI, with all its resources and expertise, cannot identify what created these precise, cauterized incisions in dead cattle across the American Southwest. The mutilation wave creates a climate of fear in rural New Mexico. Ranchers start keeping their cattle closer to their homes. People install lights, motion sensors, cameras. Some organise armed patrols. The economic impact is substantial, but the psychological impact is greater. This is a region where people pride themselves on self-reliance, on understanding their land and its dangers. But how do you defend against something you can't identify, that leaves no evidence, that operates with technology you don't understand? Then, in 1980, the story takes another turn with the introduction of Paul Bennewitz. Bennewitz was a physicist and inventor who ran Thunder Scientific Corporation in Albuquerque, a successful business that manufactured precision instruments for measuring humidity and temperature. He held patents, he had government contracts, he'd done work for classified programs. This wasn't a crank or a paranoid recluse. This was a respected member of the scientific community with security clearances and a reputation for rigorous, methodical work. He lived near Kirtland Air Force Base, home to numerous sensitive operations and one of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons facilities. His house sat on a hill with a clear view of the base's remote sections, areas where unusual activity sometimes occurred after dark. Being a scientist and an inventor, Bennewitz had equipment, radio receivers, recording devices, cameras with telephoto lenses. He was curious by nature and by profession, the kind of person who notices patterns and wants to understand their underlying causes. In 1980, he began intercepting strange radio signals. Bennewitz was experienced with radio technology. He understood frequency allocation, transmission protocols, the characteristic signatures of different types of communications equipment. What he was receiving didn't match anything in his experience. Low-frequency transmissions, pulsed in patterns that suggested data transfer rather than voice communication, coming from a bearing that pointed northeast of Albuquerque. He triangulated the signals using multiple receivers at different locations. The source appeared to be somewhere in the direction of Dulce, New Mexico, approximately 120 miles away, in the vicinity of Archuleta Mesa. Bennewitz did what any responsible scientist would do. He documented everything meticulously. He recorded the signals, he analysed their patterns, he created maps showing the apparent source location. He compiled his findings into a detailed report, and then he did something that would change his life irrevocably. He approached the Air Force with his findings. You have to understand the context. This is 1980. The Cold War is still very much active. The Soviet Union represents an existential threat. Kirtland Air Force Base is a strategic facility housing nuclear weapons and conducting classified research. An experienced physicist and defense contractor reporting unusual signals in the vicinity of sensitive installations would normally be taken seriously, and they did take him seriously, but not in the way Bennewitz expected. What happened next is documented fact, confirmed by declassified documents and later admissions by intelligence officials. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations didn't investigate Bennewitz's claims. They investigated Bennewitz himself, and then they began one of the most elaborate and sustained psychological operations ever conducted against a private US citizen. They fed him disinformation. They encouraged his most paranoid theories. They provided him with forged documents suggesting underground bases and alien technology. They sent agents posing as fellow researchers to feed him elaborate stories. They monitored his communications, his movements, his mental state. Over several years, they systematically destroyed Paul Bennewitz's grip on reality. By the mid-80s, Bennewitz was hospitalized for psychological treatment. His business suffered. His family relationships fractured. the brilliant physicist who'd held security clearances and government contracts, became known as a delusional conspiracy theorist. His legitimate findings about unusual signals drowned in a sea of false information fed to him by the very people he'd tried to help. Benowitz died in 2003. His reputation never fully recovered. And the question that haunts his story, the question that draws researchers like Elias decades later, is simple. Why would the US Air Force devote years of resources and sophisticated psychological warfare techniques to discrediting one man unless he'd actually found something they needed to keep hidden? Elias begins digging. Elias's investigation begins with phone calls to people who don't want to remember, to people who've spent decades trying to forget, to people who made peace with burying the truth so deeply that excavating it feels like a violation. Manuel Gomez died in 2003, his final years marked by declining health and a reluctance to discuss the events of '79. But his daughter, Rosa Gomez Martinez, still lives on the family ranch, maintaining the land her grandfather cleared and her father expanded. When Elias reaches her after 3 weeks of trying to track her down, there's a long pause after he introduces himself and his research topic. He can hear her breathing on the other end of the line, can hear the sound of wind through an open window, that high desert wind that never really stops, can hear her considering whether to hang up or speak. "Nobody's asked about that in 20 years, she says finally. Her voice carries the weight of memories she's tried to bury, trauma inherited and personal. My father saw things that broke him. He was a practical man, raised cattle for 40 years before those months changed everything." Rosa describes her father's transformation after the mutilations, how he went from a confident, self-assured rancher to someone who checked the locks 3 times before bed, how he installed floodlights all around the property, turning night into something approximating day, the electricity bills becoming prohibitive but preferable to darkness. How he started sleeping with a loaded .30-06 rifle beside his bed, the safety off, his hand resting on the stock even in sleep. He would stand on the porch at night, Rosa continues, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, as if the phone line itself might be monitored. Just stand there for hours, watching the mesa, watching the sky. I'd wake up at 2, 3 in the morning, and he'd be out there in his robe, perfectly still, just watching. She tells Elias about the nights when the cattle would go silent. Not the normal quiet of sleeping animals, but an eerie, absolute silence that felt wrong on a cellular level. Her father would notice it immediately, would grab his rifle and his flashlight and go out into the fields, searching for whatever was spooking his herd. Sometimes he'd find nothing. The cattle would be standing motionless, awake but frozen, as if paralysed by fear or something else. Other times he'd find them the next morning, the mutilated ones, the ones that had been alive at evening check but were dead by dawn, their bodies altered in ways that denied explanation. He used to tell me, "They come at night, Micha. They come when the dogs won't bark." The dogs. Rosa's voice breaks slightly when she mentions them. Multiple ranchers reported the same phenomenon. Their dogs, normally aggressive protectors of livestock, would fall silent before mutilation events, not cowering or hiding, but simply standing still, as if their instinct to bark and defend had been switched off like a light. Rosa's own dog, a German shepherd named Lobo, who would bark at coyotes half a mile away, stood silent on the porch the night 7 more cattle were found mutilated in the south pasture. Just stood there, looking toward the mesa, body rigid, not making a sound. My father never recovered from those months, Rosa says. Even after the mutilation stopped, even after things went back to what everyone called normal, he was never the same. He'd wake up screaming sometimes, nightmares about things watching from above, about lights that moved with intention, about feeling helpless on his own land. She agrees to meet Elias, but only after making him promise he won't use her full name, won't identify the specific location of her ranch, won't include details that might make her family identifiable. There are still consequences, she suggests, for talking too openly about what happened in '79. Elias flies to Albuquerque and drives north, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to open country to the dramatic mesas and valleys of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. He meets Rosa at a truck stop diner in Dulce, a place where they can talk without being overheard, but where their meeting won't seem unusual or noteworthy. She's in her mid-50s, with her father's strong features and eyes that carry the wariness of someone who's learned that truth is often unwelcome. She brings a box of her father's papers, photographs of mutilated cattle, veterinary reports, insurance claim forms that were rejected, correspondence with law enforcement agencies that never led anywhere. The photographs are difficult to look at. Elias has seen crime scene photos before, has looked at images of violence and death as part of his journalism training, but these images are different. The precision of the mutilations, the absence of any evidence of struggle, the almost surgical quality of the alterations, all of it suggests something beyond human capability or animal predation. The FBI came, Rosa says, spreading documents across the diner table. Spring of '79, 2 agents, very professional, very thorough. They walked the fields, they examined the bodies, they took tissue samples, they interviewed my father for hours. She produces a copy of their report, obtained years later through an FOIA request. The language is careful, clinical, designed to document without concluding. But reading between the bureaucratic phrasing, Elias can see the agents' confusion. They can't explain what they're seeing. They can attribute the mutilations to neither human nor animal causes. They note the absence of evidence that should be present and the presence of evidence that shouldn't exist. They told my father they'd be in touch, Rosa continues. They said they were pursuing multiple lines of investigation across several states. Then nothing, no follow-up, no answers, like they documented everything and then just stopped. Elias asks if her father ever speculated about what was responsible. Rosa's expression darkens. He knew, she says quietly, or thought he did. Toward the end of his life, when he'd been drinking, he'd talk about it. About lights he saw moving low over the fields. About sounds he heard. Mechanical sounds that didn't match any aircraft or vehicle he knew. About feeling watched, not by people, but by something else. Something studying him like he was an experiment. She tells Elias her father became convinced the mutilations were connected to something operating out of Archuleta Mesa. He'd driven up there, hiked some of the accessible trails, talked to Apache elders who warned him away. They told him the mesa was bad land, that their people avoided it, that there were places where the earth felt wrong and the air tasted like metal. Before Rosa leaves, she places her hand on Elias's, the same gesture her father would use when he needed someone to really listen. My father died never knowing what happened to his cattle, she says, but he died believing it was real, that it was deliberate, and that whoever or whatever was responsible didn't care about him or his animals except as subjects. That helplessness, that knowledge that he couldn't protect what was his, that's what broke him. Not the financial loss, the powerlessness. Elias tracks down 3 researchers who met with Paul Benowitz in the early 80s, before his breakdown, when he was still coherent and methodical in his claims. Each lives in a different parts of the country now. Each left New Mexico decades ago. Each tells a similar story about a brilliant man who became increasingly unstable, though they disagree on whether his instability was organic or induced. The first is Leonard Stringfield, a former Air Force intelligence officer turned UFO researcher who met Benowitz in 1981. They talk via video call, Stringfield now in his late 70s, speaking from his home in Ohio. Paul was brilliant, Stringfield says, his face filling the screen, lined with age but his eyes still sharp. Absolutely brilliant. The first time I met him, he walked me through his data like he was presenting at a scientific conference. Frequency analysis, signal intercepts, directional triangulation. This wasn't some amateur with a radio scanner. This was professional grade work. Stringfield describes visiting Benowitz's home laboratory, seeing the equipment set up, the meticulous records. Benowitz had invested tens of thousands of dollars in radio monitoring equipment. He'd developed software for signal analysis years before such tools became common. He approached the mystery like an engineering problem to be solved. But something happened between 81 and 84, Stringfield continues, his expression troubled. Paul started making claims that went beyond what his data supported. He started talking about alien bases and genetic experiments. The methodical scientist became the paranoid theorist, and it happened fast. Too fast. The second researcher, Angela Morrison, is more direct in her assessment. She's a physicist who worked with Benowitz on consulting projects in the late 70s, before any of the UFO research began. "They broke him," she states flatly over the phone, her voice carrying absolute conviction. The Paul Benowitz I knew would never have descended into the paranoid ramblings he became known for without external pressure. Someone fed him disinformation systematically and deliberately. Morrison tells Elias about watching Benowitz change, how he became increasingly agitated, how he started seeing patterns that weren't there, how he began trusting sources that, in retrospect, were obviously feeding him false information, designed to discredit everything he'd legitimately discovered. The Air Force admitted it later, Morrison says. They admitted running operations against Paul, but they framed it as protective, as trying to steer a civilian away from sensitive installations. That's not what it was. It was character assassination through psychological manipulation. The third researcher refuses to speak on record, but agrees to an off-the-record conversation. He's a former NSA analyst who worked signals intelligence in the Southwest during the early 80s. He won't confirm or deny specific operations, but he provides context that makes Elias's blood run cold. Paul Benowitz intercepted real signals, the analyst says. I can't tell you what they were or where they originated, but the response he received, the level of attention directed at him, that tells you everything you need to know. We don't run multi-year psychological operations against private citizens who've stumbled onto nothing. The analyst explains how these operations work, how you identify someone who's found something sensitive, then feed them a mixture of truth and fiction until they can no longer distinguish between them. How you encourage their most extreme theories while systematically discrediting them publicly. How you transform a credible witness into a cautionary tale. The goal isn't to silence them, the analyst explains. The goal is to make them silence themselves by destroying their own credibility. Paul Benowitz did more damage to his own claims than any government denial ever could, because by the end, everything he said sounded crazy, including the parts that were true. Elias's most disturbing interviews come from Navajo and Apache locals who've lived near Dulce for generations, whose connection to the land predates American sovereignty, predates Spanish colonization, predates the written history that treats this region as discovered when Europeans arrived. They speak carefully, as if the land itself might be listening, as if speaking too openly about certain things might draw attention better left avoided. Several refuse to speak at all. Others agree only to talk off record, their words documented in Elias's notebooks but not recorded, their names replaced with descriptions. Elderly man, former Apache tribal council, member, or woman, mid-60s traditional healer. Reed Sosi is different. She agrees to speak on record, tells Elias to use her name, says she's too old to care about consequences anymore. She's 78, a grandmother and great-grandmother, with family roots in the region going back so many generations that the exact count has been lost to time. They meet at a diner in Dulce, the same one where Elias met Rosa. Marie arrives exactly on time, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body has been worn down by decades of hard living but whose mind remains sharp. She orders coffee. She doesn't drink and speaks in a voice barely above a whisper, forcing Elias to lean close to hear her over the ambient noise of the diner. My people have stories about Archuleta Mesa that go back centuries, she begins, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup for warmth despite the summer heat outside. We call it different names in Apache. The closest translation is the place where the earth breathes, or the place of deep voices. Marie explains that in traditional Apache cosmology, certain locations are considered powerful, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin. Archuleta Mesa is one of these places, but not in a benevolent sense. There are caves, she continues, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the diner walls as if seeing the landscape in her mind. Tunnels that go deep. My grandfather told me stories his grandfather told him about warriors who went into those caves and came back changed. Some didn't come back at all. When Elias asks what changed means, Marie takes a long moment before answering. Their minds, she says finally. They would see things that weren't there or stop seeing things that were. They would speak in voices that didn't sound like themselves. They would know things they shouldn't know and forget things they should remember. We learned, over generations, to avoid those caves, to mark them as forbidden, to teach our children that some darkness is meant to remain unexplored. She slides a piece of paper across the table. On it are names and dates written in careful handwriting. 12 entries, spanning from 1982 to 2015. Missing people, Marie says quietly. Hikers, hunters, tourists, people who went into the area around Archuleta Mesa and never came out. The Forest Service says it's the terrain. The Bureau of Land Management says people get lost. They organise searches, use helicopters and dogs, and they find nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of where these people went. She tells Elias about her cousin, Benjamin Sosi, who worked search and rescue for 15 years. Benjamin was skilled at tracking, at reading the landscape, at finding people who didn't want to be found. He participated in searches for 6 of the names on Marie's list. He told me once, after he retired, that they were told to avoid certain areas during searches, Marie says, her voice dropping even lower. Grid coordinates marked off limits by federal authorities. No explanation given, just orders that certain zones were not to be entered by search teams, even if tracks or evidence pointed in those directions. Benjamin died in 2018, but before his death he told Marie something that still haunts her. He said on one search, in 2007, they found a camp, tent, supplies, equipment, fresh food, nothing disturbed, like the person had just stepped away. But there were no tracks leading from the camp, no signs of where they'd gone, just the camp, perfectly preserved, and no person. The missing person from that search, a 28-year-old geologist named Sarah Chen conducting soil surveys, was never found. Her family eventually held a memorial service without a body. The official conclusion was that she likely fell into a ravine or crevice, and her remains were unrecoverable. But Benjamin told Marie there were no ravines or crevices within 2 miles of that camp. The geology didn't support that explanation. It was as if Sarah Chen had simply ceased to exist mid-activity, leaving her belongings behind as the only evidence she'd been there at all. Before Marie leaves, she places her hand on Elias's. Her skin is warm despite the cold coffee cup she'd been holding, and her grip is surprisingly strong. They hear things under the ground, she says, her dark eyes holding his with an intensity that allows no room for dismissal. Machinery where no machinery should be. Voices that sound human but use words that make no sense. Lights in the caves that move with purpose. My people have heard these things for longer than the United States has existed. She stands, gathering her bag, preparing to leave, but she pauses, looking down at Elias with an expression that might be pity or might be resignation. The white people who came to this land, they didn't believe our warnings about the mesa. They thought we were primitive, superstitious. Then they went digging, and they found what we have always known was there. The difference is we respected it, avoided it, survived by keeping our distance. They tried to control it. That's the mistake that changes everything. Marie walks out of the diner into the bright New Mexico sunlight. Elias watches her go, his recorder still running, the list of names still on the table before him. 12 people, 12 disappearances, 12 families with questions that will never be answered, and beneath it all, under tons of rock and earth, machinery humming in places where no machinery should exist. Act 2. The Government Connection Declassified Hints. Elias spends 3 months buried in FOIA requests and declassified documents, transforming his apartment into something between a research archive and a conspiracy theorist's lair. His walls are covered with printouts, timelines, maps with pins connected by red string. His thesis. Advisor stops returning his emails. His funding situation becomes precarious. Friends start avoiding his calls. But he can't stop because what he's finding isn't smoking gun proof of underground alien bases, but something almost more disturbing, evidence of systematic misdirection and unexplained government activity concentrated around a single remote location with no obvious strategic value. The FOIA requests yield results slowly, each document arriving with heavy redactions, black bars obscuring names, dates, operational details. But even redacted, the documents tell a story. Air Force OSI memos from 1982, their headers stamped with classification levels that should have expired decades ago, discuss what they call Benowitz activity and containment protocols. The language is bureaucratic but telling. They're not investigating whether Benowitz's claims have merit. They're containing him, managing the problem he represents. One memo, dated September 1982, outlines a strategic disinformation campaign designed to redirect subjects' research focus toward non-sensitive areas while maintaining subjects' belief in primary hypothesis. In plain language, feed Benowitz false information about aliens to distract him from whatever he'd actually found. But here's what keeps Elias awake at night. Why would a private citizen investigating radio signals require containment protocols? You don't deploy strategic disinformation campaigns against someone who's chasing nothing. You ignore them, or you politely correct them, or you send them a cease and desist letter if they're trespassing on secure frequencies. You don't wage psychological warfare against them unless they've found something real. NSA documents released in 2015, part of a broader transparency initiative that nobody paid much attention to, show surveillance orders for radio interception in the Dulce area between 1980 and 1984. The stated purpose is redacted. The target of the surveillance is redacted. The results of the surveillance are redacted. But the resource allocation is visible. Dedicated monitoring stations, specialized equipment, trained personnel assigned for 4 continuous years. Elias does the math. The cost of maintaining that level of surveillance in a remote area with minimal population would run into millions of dollars. For what? To monitor radio signals in the middle of nowhere? To watch a handful of ranchers and a small Apache community? The disproportion between resources expended and official explanation offered suggests something significant enough to warrant sustained, expensive attention. Then there are the FBI reports on the cattle mutilation phenomenon, obtained through multiple FOIA requests and cross-reference with state police records and veterinary reports. The documents span from 1975 through 1984, hundreds of pages documenting mutilation events across New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas and Montana. The reports are clinical, detailed, increasingly frustrated. FBI agents and forensic veterinarians document tissue samples showing thermal cutting effects, inconsistent with predation or known surgical tools. One report from a veterinary pathologist at New Mexico State University, dated April 1979, is particularly unsettling. The pathologist, a specialist in forensic animal medicine with 23 years of experience, describes examining a mutilated cow from the Gomez Ranch. He notes hemoglobin distribution patterns suggesting rapid exsanguination through unknown means, possibly vacuum extraction. The incision edges show cellular damage consistent with temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, but there's no burning or charring of surrounding tissue, as if the heat was impossibly focused, more precise than any cutting tool available to veterinary or surgical medicine at the time. The level of precision observed, the pathologist writes, exceeds the capabilities of even the most sophisticated surgical facilities. The absence of forensic evidence that should accompany either human perpetrators or animal predators suggests a methodology outside my professional experience and knowledge. A FBI summary report from 1980 attempts to draw conclusions from hundreds of documented cases. The report notes that despite extensive investigation, including laboratory analysis, field interviews, and consultation with medical and veterinary experts, no definitive explanation can be offered for the observed mutilation phenomena. The precision of the alterations and the absence of conventional forensic evidence preclude standard explanatory frameworks. Then, buried in a footnote, a single sentence that Elias highlights and photographs and stores in multiple locations. Tissue analysis conducted at Federal Facility Omega-7 indicates possible exposure to directed energy sources of unknown configuration. Federal Facility Omega-7, Elias searches every database he can access. The designation appears nowhere else in publicly available documents. It's a ghost reference, a hint of infrastructure that officially doesn't exist. But the psychological operations angle is what truly disturbs him, because it's documented, admitted, and still partially classified. Declassified documents confirm that from 1977 to 1981, Air Force intelligence ran active measures against Paul Benowitz under a program codenamed Desert Shepherd. They fed him false information about underground bases and alien technology. They created forged documents suggesting elaborate conspiracies. They encouraged his beliefs while systematically destroying his credibility. They monitored his mental health deterioration with the detached precision of scientists observing an experiment. One memo, written by an Air Force psychologist in 1983, assesses Benowitz's psychological state and recommends continued reinforcement of constructed narratives to maintain subjects' focus on non-operational areas. The memo notes that Benowitz is approaching critical psychological threshold, but recommends maintaining current operational tempo unless subject presents danger to himself or others. They knew they were destroying him. They documented his deterioration. They made calculated decisions about how far to push before his mental collapse might create unwanted attention. And they did it all in the service of protecting something near Dulce, New Mexico. Elias files FOIA requests for the files that remain classified, the documents that should have been automatically declassified decades ago under standard protocols. His requests are carefully worded, specific, citing exact statutes and precedents. He's learned the language of FOIA law, the magic phrases that theoretically compel disclosure. Each request comes back denied. The denials follow a template. The requested documents, if they exist, would contain information that could reasonably be expected to cause damage to national security if disclosed. The information remains properly classified under Executive Order 1295 and is exempt from disclosure under FOIA Exemption 1. But here's the thing that makes Elias's hands shake as he reads these denials. The exemption claims relate to ongoing operations and current intelligence activities. Ongoing operations, current activities. In reference to events from 40 plus years ago, in reference to a psychological operation against a man who died nearly 2 decades ago, in reference to cattle mutilations and UFO sightings that the official narrative dismisses as mass hysteria and mundane phenomena. If it's all nonsense, if there's nothing to hide, why are documents from the late 70s and early 80s still classified in 2021? What are they still protecting? Elias creates timelines, cross-referencing dates of mutilation events with dates of signal intercepts reported by Benowitz, with dates of unusual seismic activity recorded by USGS monitors, with dates of military exercises in the region. Patterns emerge that could be coincidence or could be something else. Spikes in mutilation reports correlate with increases in radio signal intercepts. Both correlate with unexplained seismic events that show rhythmic patterns inconsistent with natural earthquakes. All 3 phenomena cluster around Archuleta Mesa with statistical significance that resists random explanation. Something is happening in that location. something sustained, deliberate, and significant enough that the government devoted enormous resources to monitoring it, containing information about it, and destroying the credibility of anyone who got too close to understanding it. Elias compiles his findings into a timeline that stretches across his living room wall. 1967, first documented UFO sightings. 1975 through 79, cattle mutilation wave. 1980, Benowitz intercepts signals. 1980 through 84, government surveillance and psychological operations. 1995, Schneider gives Denver lecture. 1996, Schneider found dead. And beneath all of it, the constant presence of Archuleta Mesa, rising from the high desert like a monument to secrets the government has decided the public has no right to know. The anonymous contact. The encrypted message appears in Elias's inbox on a Tuesday morning in April 2022, arriving through an anonymous email service routed through servers in Iceland, Switzerland and Estonia. The sender's address is a string of random characters that will never be traceable. The message itself is brief, almost terse, written by someone who understands operational security and chooses every word with care. You're asking the right questions, you're looking in the wrong places, the base is real. Schneider was partially correct. Meet me. Instructions will follow if you're serious. Elias's first instinct is to delete it. This is how journalists get compromised, how careful researchers get led into traps, how people investigating sensitive topics end up discredited or worse. Anonymous contacts are the oldest trick in the information warfare playbook. Promise revelation, deliver misdirection, and document the target's gullibility for later exploitation. But something about the message's phrasing, its specificity about Schneider being partially correct rather than completely right or completely wrong, suggests someone with actual insider knowledge, someone who knows the full picture and recognises that Schneider's account, while genuine in parts, was incomplete or misunderstood in others. Elias responds with a test. How do I know you're not trying to Benowitz me? The reply comes within an hour. Paul's mistake wasn't investigating the signals. His mistake was trusting people who claim to be helping him. I'm not claiming to help you. I'm offering information. What you do with it is your choice. They negotiate the terms through layers of encryption. The contact insists on a public place, broad daylight, multiple exit points, no recording devices, no witnesses. They settle on the Santa Fe rail yard district during the Saturday farmers market, crowds of tourists and locals providing both cover and safety. The contact provides a detailed protocol. Elias should arrive at 10 in the morning, buy a coffee from a specific vendor, then walk the perimeter of the market counterclockwise. Someone will approach him. They'll speak for exactly 20 minutes, then part ways. No subsequent contact will be possible through the email channel. Elias spends the week before the meeting running through every scenario, every possible trap. He tells a friend where he's going, leaves detailed notes, and a safe deposit box sets up a dead man's switch that will release his research if he doesn't check in within 48 hours. He's probably being paranoid, but paranoia and caution become indistinguishable when investigating subjects where people have actually died under mysterious circumstances. The Santa Fe rail yard on a Saturday morning is exactly what the contact promised. Crowded, public, impossible to control or monitor completely. Tourists browse artisan crafts. Families buy fresh produce. Musicians play for donations. It's aggressively normal, the kind of setting where clandestine meetings seem absurd. Elias buys his coffee and begins his counterclockwise circuit. He's halfway through his first lap when a man falls into step beside him, matching his pace exactly. The approach is so casual, so natural, that anyone watching would think they're friends who just ran into each other. The man is in his mid-60s, trim and precise in his movements, dressed in the kind of nondescript outdoor wear that's universal in New Mexico. His eyes are what catch Elias's attention, sharp, constantly scanning, taking in everything while appearing to focus on nothing. These are eyes trained by decades of operational awareness, by work that requires noticing threats before they develop. "Keep walking," the man says quietly. His voice is educated, with hints of East Coast upbringing softened by years in the Southwest. "Don't look at me directly. We're having a casual conversation. We're old acquaintances catching up." He introduces himself only as Robert, though everything about the introduction suggests this isn't his real name. It's a working name, chosen for this specific interaction, meaningless beyond this context. They walk through the market, weaving between stalls, Robert's eyes constantly tracking their surroundings. He identifies potential surveillance with subtle shifts of his gaze. A man in a parked car who's been sitting too long without buying anything. A woman with a camera who's taking pictures of people rather than produce, angles that could conceal directional microphones. "I worked at Sandia National Laboratories from 1976 to 2008. Robert begins, his voice low, but clear enough for Elias to hear over the market noise. "Materials Engineering Division. We did contract work for multiple agencies, DOE, DOD, projects I couldn't discuss even with my security clearance, projects that appeared on budget spreadsheets as line items without descriptions." He describes a career spent in the shadow world between acknowledged government programs and black budget operations that officially don't exist. Working on materials for projects he wasn't allowed to know the purpose of, shipping specialised components to locations he wasn't permitted to visit, signing non-disclosure agreements that turned his work into something he couldn't discuss with family or friends. "In 1983, I was part of a team designing composite materials for underground construction," Robert continues. "They pause at a fruit stand examining apples while they talk. High-strength concrete with radiation-shielding properties, acoustic dampening systems for containing sound in subterranean environments, biological containment seals designed for laboratories working with hazardous materials. The specifications," he explains, "were unusual. The materials needed to function at depths exceeding 1,000 feet, in environments with specific temperature and humidity parameters, with redundant containment systems suggesting work with exceptionally dangerous substances. The requisition orders were tagged with a facility designation, Unit Delta 5, Robert says. That designation appeared on internal logistics documents, shipping manifests, budget allocations. But when I tried to find information about what Unit Delta 5 was or where it was located, I hit walls. Classified, need to know, above your clearance level." He tells Elias about becoming curious, the way engineers become curious when specifications don't make sense, when projects seem to violate standard protocols. He started paying attention to patterns, shipments going to the same redacted location, materials ordered in quantities suggesting large-scale construction, timelines that implied ongoing operations rather than single projects. "The shipping addresses were always redacted in the documents I saw," Robert says. "They've moved to a quiet section of the market, ostensibly admiring handmade pottery. But requisition forms from the Geological Survey Division weren't as carefully scrubbed. They included topographical coordinates for delivery locations. Those coordinates pointed to an area near Dulce, New Mexico." Robert explains what he believes the Dulce facility actually is, and his explanation is more disturbing for its mundanity than any alien conspiracy theory would be. He describes a multi-level underground installation with compartmentalized purposes, where workers on different levels never interact, where each section operates in isolation without awareness of the full scope. "Level 1 through 3, that's standard military research," Robert says, his voice taking on the quality of someone who's rehearsed this explanation in his mind countless times. "Black budget projects, weapons development, classified material storage, nothing exotic by Department of Defense standards. You could find similar facilities in Nevada, Utah, New Mexico. Underground installations designed to survive nuclear war, to protect critical research, to operate independent of surface infrastructure." He pauses to buy a jar of local honey, the transaction giving them a moment to ensure no one is paying attention to their conversation. Level 4 is psychological operations, Robert continues as they walk. Information warfare, strategic deception, the kind of work the Air Force was doing when they ran operations against Benowitz. They study how information spreads, how to contain leaks, how to discredit sources without making martyrs of them. His voice drops lower, forcing Elias to lean in slightly to hear. Level 5 is listed in some documents as a genetic research facility. The specific phrasing in a 1983 budget allocation I saw was interspecies compatibility studies, not cross-species, not comparative genetics. Interspecies, which implies comparison between species that have some reason to need compatibility assessment. Elias feels his skepticism fighting with the meticulous detail Robert provides. This isn't wild speculation. This is someone reciting from memory documents he's spent years thinking about. Documents that haunt him enough that he's risking this meeting despite obvious personal cost. And level 6, Elias asks, his voice steadier than he feels. Robert's expression darkens, and for the first time his careful surveillance of their surroundings falters, as if the mention of level 6 pulls his attention inward. There are rumours, he says carefully. Personnel who worked the upper levels and heard things. Nightmare Hall, they called it. Supposed collaboration between human researchers and non-human entities working on genetic material exchange, hybrid development programs, compatibility testing for purposes no one would discuss. Before Elias can respond with the obvious objection, the reasonable dismissal of alien conspiracy theories, Robert pulls out a tablet computer from his bag. The motion is casual, as if he's just checking email or showing photos. But what appears on the screen is a document that makes Elias's breath catch. It's a geological survey map from 1968, stamped with Department of Interior seals and Bureau of Land Management authorization numbers. The document appears authentic, with a kind of degradation and period-appropriate formatting that's difficult to forge convincingly. It shows Archuleta Mesa and the surrounding area in topographical detail, but beneath the surface features annotations indicating hollow chambers, multiple levels of them marked in blue ink with dimensional annotations. The chambers show clear geometric organisation, regular spacing connecting passages. Natural cave systems don't form in these patterns. These are engineered spaces, marked on a map 4 years before anyone outside classified circles was talking about underground bases at Dulce. This survey was commissioned in '68, Robert says, zooming in on specific sections. 4 years before Schneider's alleged firefight, 8 years before the cattle mutilations, 12 years before Benowitz started intercepting signals. They knew what was under that mesa before any of the conspiracy theories existed. He highlights a section showing a large central chamber with multiple levels extending downward. The annotations indicate depths exceeding 1,500 feet, with reinforced ceiling structures and what appear to be vertical access shafts. The survey was classified immediately after completion, Robert continues. I only saw it because a clerical error in the document control system at Sandia briefly made it accessible to my clearance level in 1987. When I tried to access it again 3 days later, it was gone from the system, but I remembered it. I've spent 35 years remembering it. He uploads the document to an encrypted drive and provides Elias with access codes. A string of characters Elias immediately commits to memory and writes in multiple secure locations. I'm telling you this because what's happening there, whatever it is, the public has a right to know, Robert says, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who's made a difficult ethical choice. But I'm also warning you, the people running this operation, they don't make mistakes. If you keep digging, they'll know, and they'll respond. Not necessarily with violence or obvious intimidation, but with something more sophisticated. They'll manage you, study you, turn you into data that helps them refine their containment protocols. Robert checks his watch, notes that they've been talking for exactly 18 minutes. In 2 minutes, he'll walk away, and this conversation will end. One more thing you should understand, he says as they make a final circuit past the vegetable stands. The psychological operation against Benowitz wasn't a failure. It was a wildly successful experiment. They learned how to destroy a credible witness without making him disappear, how to transform legitimate findings into conspiracy theories by feeding the source false information until truth and fiction became inseparable in his mind. Every operation since has used those techniques. Benowitz was the prototype. Everyone who's investigated Dulce since has been running variations of the same program. He stops walking, turns to face Elias directly for the first time. His eyes carry a weight of knowledge that seems almost burdensome. "They're going to do it to you," Robert says quietly. "They're probably already doing it. Every source you contact might be real, or might be feeding you disinformation. Every document you find might be authentic or might be planted. By the time you realise you can't trust your own research, you'll have discredited yourself so thoroughly that nothing you say will matter. That's the real genius of the system. They don't suppress the truth. They drown it in so much noise that no one can distinguish signal from static." Robert walks away through the farmers' market crowd, disappearing among the vendors and tourists, becoming just another figure browsing produce on a Saturday morning. Elias never sees him again. The email address stops working within an hour of their meeting. Every trace of their communication is wiped from servers that thought they kept permanent records. But Elias has the map. He has the coordinates. And he has a terrible certainty that everything Robert told him is true, which means everything that comes next is already anticipated, already planned for, already part of someone else's carefully designed response protocol. The question isn't whether he should stop. The question is whether continuing serves truth, or whether it makes him a willing participant in his own manipulation. He looks at the tablet, at the geological survey showing chambers that officially don't exist, and makes a choice that will define everything that follows. He's going to Dulce. Act 3. The descent into Archuleta Mesa. Meeting the others. October 2022. Elias's research has consumed nearly a year of his life. His thesis advisor has stopped returning his emails. His graduate funding is running out. Everyone who cares about him thinks he's lost perspective, but he can't stop. He drives northeast from Albuquerque, watching the landscape shift from city sprawl to high desert to the imposing mesas of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. Dulce sits in a valley, a small cluster of buildings dwarfed by the vast landscape and the looming presence of Archuleta Mesa. The town feels like it's watching him. Through local contacts, Elias arranges a meeting with Edmund Valdez, a former Jicarilla Apache tribal police officer who resigned abruptly in 1994 after 23 years of service. Edmund is now 71, living in a small house on the edge of Dulce proper. He invites Elias in with the wary hospitality of someone who's told his story before and not been believed. "You want to know about the night I stopped being a cop," Edmund says, pouring coffee with hands that still move with authority despite his age. "February 19th, 94. I responded to calls about earthquake sounds coming from under the mesa. Multiple witnesses, not tourists, locals, people who know the difference between thunder, drilling and something else." Edmund describes arriving at a trailhead near one of the old uranium mine entrances, long since officially sealed. The ground was vibrating. Not the rolling motion of an earthquake, but a steady rhythmic pulse, like massive machinery operating far below. We had seismographs at the station. They registered nothing, no earthquake, but I felt it through my boots. We all did. He shows Elias photographs, taken with a film camera, of scorch marks in cave systems near the mesa. The patterns are unusual, radiating outward from central points in ways that don't match lightning strikes or campfires. Then Edmund produces audio files, transferred from old cassette tapes to digital format. He plays one. It's the sound of deep, rhythmic humming, so low it's almost subsonic. Elias feels it in his chest as much as hears it. Recorded in 2003 by a geological survey team, Edmund explains. They were doing environmental impact studies, found this in one of the accessible caves, never released publicly. The team member who gave me this copy quit 6 months later. Wouldn't say why. But the most chilling evidence Edmund presents is a folder of missing person reports. Cases from 1981, 1989, 1992, all within a 15-mile radius of Archuleta Mesa. All officially unsolved. 2 were experienced hikers. One was a geologist, another was a journalist working on a story about land use conflicts on the reservation. The FBI came for 2 of these, Edmund says, tapping the folder. Took the files, the evidence logs, everything. Said it was part of a broader investigation. We never heard anything again. The families never got answers. Edmund walks Elias to the door as evening settles over Dulce. The mesa is a dark silhouette against the sunset. I spent 23 years keeping people safe, he says quietly. But there's a boundary out there, invisible but real. Inside that boundary I couldn't help anyone. Nobody could. After that night in '94, after feeling whatever was moving under that ground, I realised I was protecting people from the wrong things. He looks directly at Elias. They run the base, not us. Remember that if you go looking. Breaking into the tunnel system. Elias spends 3 days hiking the area around Archuleta Mesa, ostensibly documenting the landscape, actually mapping old mine entrances against Historical Bureau of Indian Affairs surveys from the 70s. He finds what he's looking for on the 4th day, a ventilation shaft, partially concealed by collapse and vegetation, that matches coordinates from a 1974 mining safety inspection report. The shaft is marked on old maps as sealed, but the seal is clearly compromised, broken from the inside based on how the concrete is fractured. He waits until after midnight. The moon is a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by without a flashlight. He's equipped with a small camera, a voice recorder, climbing gear, and a level of determination that overrides his better judgment. The shaft descends at a 40-degree angle. The walls show evidence of industrial drilling, clean and uniform. This wasn't natural cave formation. About 200 feet down, the shaft levels out into a horizontal tunnel. That's when Elias notices the air. It's moving. Not the stagnant air of a sealed mine, but a steady breeze coming from deeper in the complex. Conditioned air. Cool and filtered. He follows the airflow. The tunnel branches, connecting to what appears to be a much larger system. The walls here are reinforced with concrete and steel. There's infrastructure, ventilation ducts, electrical conduits, junction boxes with recent manufacture dates. This isn't abandoned, this is active. Elias moves deeper, his camera recording everything. The smell shifts, becoming chemical, antiseptic, like a hospital or a laboratory. The mechanical sounds grow louder, pumps, air handlers, something that sounds like generators in the distance. He reaches a junction where 3 tunnels converge. On the wall is a faded sign, military standard font. Unit D5, Joint Genetic Operations Center. Authorized personnel only biosafety level 4 protocols in effect. His hands shake as he photographs the sign. JGOC, Joint Genetic Operations Center. Robert's information was accurate. Then he hears voices. Footsteps echoing from one of the adjacent tunnels. Multiple people moving with purpose. Elias retreats, but the complex branches and he's disoriented. He takes a wrong turn and finds himself in a wider corridor with LED lighting and a large steel blast door. The door is marked D5 Primary Access. Security cameras rotate on mounts. Alarms begin to sound. Elias runs, adrenaline overriding thought. He crashes through the tunnel system, scraping against walls, his camera banging against his chest. He can hear pursuit behind him, coordinated and professional. He finds a side passage, squeezes through, emerges into what looks like a natural cave system. The sounds of pursuit fade. He climbs, finding another shaft, pulling himself up through darkness and panic until he emerges into cold night air. He doesn't stop running until he reaches his car, parked 3 miles away on a Forest Service road. He's violated federal property. He's documented classified infrastructure. He's crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The question now is what happens next. Act 4. The capture and the truth. Detained by unknown forces. Elias makes it 17 miles before the black SUVs force him off the road. It happens with professional efficiency. No sirens, no dramatic chase. Just 3 vehicles boxing him in on a remote stretch of highway near the Colorado border, their headlights turning night into day. Men in tactical gear, no insignia, weapons drawn but not pointed. They're calm, practiced. This isn't their first extraction. Step out of the vehicle, keep your hands visible. They search his car with systematic thoroughness. They find his camera, his notes, his laptop, his phone. Everything goes into evidence bags with alphanumeric designations. They find the GPS tracker he didn't know was attached to his undercarriage. "How long have you been following me?" Elias asks. No one answers. They transport him in a vehicle with blackout windows. He loses track of direction and time. When they finally stop and remove him, he's in an underground parking structure. Concrete, fluorescent lighting, the hum of ventilation systems. They take him to a room that's aggressively ordinary. Grey walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, a camera in the corner, its red light steady and unblinking. He sits there for 6 hours before anyone speaks to him. The 2 men who enter wear business casual clothing, the kind of nondescript professional attire that could belong to middle managers at any corporation. But their bearing is military. Intelligence. Community. They sit across from him, tablet computers in hand. "You entered a restricted federal facility," the first one says. No introduction, no badge. "You photographed classified infrastructure. You're facing charges under the Espionage Act." The Espionage Act. The same statute used against Snowden and Manning. Decades in federal prison. "I'm a journalist," Elias says, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm researching." "You're a graduate student with no press credentials investigating conspiracy theories," the second man interrupts. "You broke into a Department of Energy secure research facility. Your intentions are irrelevant. Your actions are prosecutable." They show him photographs on their tablets. Paul Benowitz in his workshop, looking gaunt and paranoid. Phil Schneider at that Denver lecture. 2 hikers who vanished in 2009, their faces smiling in photos that became missing person posters. Then a photograph of Elias himself climbing into the ventilation shaft. "You were in level 2, the first man says. "You saw signage for Unit Delta 5. You photographed infrastructure belonging to a joint operations centre. What you didn't see, what you couldn't have understood even if you had, is context." The second man leans forward. The facility under Archuleta Mesa is a collaborative research installation. It operates under joint oversight of the Department of Energy, the Air Force Directorate of Logistics, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Its work is classified, its very existence is classified, and people who compromise that classification face consequences. "Then charge me," Elias says. "Put me in front of a judge. Let me make my case public." They exchange a glance. Something passes between them, a decision made silently. "We're not going to charge you," the first man says. "You're going to be released." They let him go. The next 48 hours blur into a surreal nightmare of bureaucratic processing. They photograph him. They take his fingerprints. They have him sign documents he's not allowed to read completely, non-disclosure agreements with criminal penalties, waivers of rights he doesn't fully understand. They don't interrogate him about who he's talked to or what he knows. They don't seem concerned about his research. It's as if his entire investigation, everything he's done, is already known and already contained. On the morning of the 3rd day, they transport him again. This time, when the vehicle stops and the doors open, he's standing on a street corner in Santa Fe. Morning traffic, coffee shops, normalcy. His phone is gone. His camera is destroyed, handed back to him in a clear plastic bag, the memory card removed and the housing smashed. His car is nowhere to be found, and when he asks about it, the men simply point to a taxi waiting at the curb. Your vehicle will be returned to your Los Angeles address within 2 weeks, one of them says. Go home, resume your life, forget what you think you saw. They drive away, leaving him standing in the morning sun with nothing but the clothes on his back and a growing sense of unreality. He checks into a motel and tries to process what happened. They caught him in a restricted facility. They had every legal justification to prosecute him into oblivion. Instead, they released him with what amounts to a warning. Why? He searches his pockets, looking for his wallet, and finds something that wasn't there before. A small white card, unmarked except for a single line of text printed in black. Stop digging. You were in level 2. There are 7. 7 levels. He made it to level 2. What's below? Act 5. The information wore the cover-up machine. Back in Los Angeles, Elias tries to rebuild his research from memory. He creates new anonymous accounts. He begins posting what he knows on conspiracy forums, Reddit threads, anywhere people might listen. The posts disappear within hours, not removed by moderators, not flagged by users, simply gone, as if they never existed. His accounts get shadow banned. His IP address gets blocked. When he tries to contact journalists who cover national security issues, his emails bounce back or go unanswered. He's being suppressed systematically and efficiently. Desperate, he begins analysing historical data. He looks at online discussion trends around Dulce space over the past 2 decades. What he finds is disturbing. Discussion spikes occur in 3 distinct periods: 1999, 2012, and 2020. He cross-references these spikes with other data. In 1999, FEMA conducted large-scale disaster response exercises across New Mexico. The exercises involved underground rescue scenarios and lasted 3 weeks. In 2012, residents near Dulce reported unusual air traffic, military helicopters, unmarked cargo planes. The activity lasted for 2 months, then stopped abruptly. In 2020, the USGS recorded a series of small seismic events under Archuleta Mesa. The events showed unusual patterns, rhythmic rather than random, consistent with underground excavation or construction. Each spike in public interest coincides with increased activity at or around the Dulce site. Each time, the discussion gets loud, then gets quiet. Information gets shared, then disappears. It's a pattern, a cycle, as if someone is deliberately allowing information to surface, then systematically removing it, studying how far it spreads and who pays attention. Elias realizes he's not uncovering a conspiracy. He's participating in a study. The entire phenomenon, the leaks, the suppression, the cycle of revelation and concealment, it's managed. It's controlled. The conspiracy isn't the base. The conspiracy is the information warfare around it. The final confession. The message from Robert arrives 6 weeks after Elias's return to Los Angeles. It comes through the same encrypted channels, but this time there's an urgency to it. They know I've been talking to you. This is the last time. What I'm about to tell you is the truth, as far as I understand it. Whether you believe me is irrelevant. You deserve to know why they let you go. What follows is a narrative that Elias reads 3 times, each time hoping he's misunderstood. According to Robert, the Dulce facility wasn't built to experiment on anyone. It was built to facilitate an exchange. In 1954, the Eisenhower administration made contact with a non-human intelligence. This isn't speculation. This happened. The contact was managed through a series of intermediaries and resulted in an agreement. The terms of that agreement are above my clearance, but the implementation is not. Robert describes Dulce as one of several exchange facilities established in the late 50s and early 60s. The US provided access, infrastructure, and research collaboration. In return, they received technology and a guarantee of non-interference. The genetic research programs weren't about creating hybrids or conducting experiments. They were about compatibility studies, understanding biology different from ours. The exchange involved information, genetic material, research methodologies, both sides studying the other. Elias wants to dismiss this as insanity. But Robert's message continues with specific details that match too many pieces of his research. Paul Benowitz intercepted real signals. The Air Force destroyed him because he got too close to understanding the communication protocols. Phil Schneider was telling the truth about the firefight, but it wasn't an ambush. It was a containment breach, security protocol failure. People died on both sides. Both sides. You stumbled into level 2, Robert's message continues. That's administrative and logistics. You saw the signage for joint genetic operations because that's where they process biological samples and conduct comparison studies. You didn't see level 5 or 6. Level 5 is where the actual exchange takes place. Level 6 is where they keep the agreements themselves, the contracts, the terms, the proof. Robert's final paragraph is a warning and an explanation. They let you go because you're not a threat. Your data, your investigation, your research patterns, your online behaviour, it all feeds into their analysis of information containment. They study how far someone can get, what they can find, how they respond to suppression. You think you were investigating them. They were studying you. And now that the study's complete, you're free to go about your life, knowing that anything you say will be dismissed as conspiracy theory, anything you prove will be deleted, and anyone you convince will be written off as delusional. The message ends with a single sentence. The truth isn't being hidden, it's being managed. Ending. The exit that isn't an exit, December 2022. Elias sits in his Los Angeles apartment, surrounded by the fragments of his investigation. His thesis is abandoned. His graduate funding is gone. His relationships are strained to breaking. But he has one thing left, the knowledge that he's right. The apartment has been searched. He knows this because small things are different. A book moved slightly, papers in a different order, the scratches around his door lock that weren't there before. His neighbours mention men in suits asking questions about him. Polite questions, official questions. He's being watched, assessed, catalogued. Elias makes a final decision. He uploads everything he can remember, everything he's reconstructed, to an encrypted site hosted in a country with strong digital privacy laws. He writes his testimony clearly and carefully, knowing it will be read by exactly 3 types of people. Those who already believe and need no convincing, those who will never believe regardless of evidence, and the analysts whose job is to monitor how this information spreads. His final words are chosen with precision. The Dulce base is real. I've seen it. I've walked its corridors. I've been detained and released by the people who run it. What's under level 6 isn't the problem, though I suspect it would reshape our understanding of reality. The real problem is how easily they made me stop talking about it. Not through threats, not through force, but through something more insidious. By making the truth indistinguishable from paranoia. By ensuring that anyone who speaks about this sounds exactly like someone who's lost their grip on reality. By creating a system where the evidence can exist in plain sight because nobody with credibility will touch it. They don't need to hide the truth anymore. They've made the truth hide itself. I know what I saw. I know what exists under Archuleta Mesa. And I know that by the time you read this, it won't matter. Because the mechanism designed to keep this secret isn't classification or suppression. It's something far more elegant. The certainty that anyone who talks about it will be dismissed as exactly what I sound like right now. There are 7 levels beneath the mesa. I made it to level 2. What's on the levels below is less important than the question of why we're not supposed to ask. What's being studied down there matters less than who agreed to let it be studied. What's being exchanged is secondary to the fact that an exchange is happening at all. They let me go because I'm not dangerous to them. I'm useful. Another data point. Another case study in how far someone can dig before they're neutralised not by violence or prosecution, but by the simple act of being made to sound crazy. So, here's my testimony. Believe it or dismiss it. Share it or forget it. Either way, underneath a mesa in New Mexico, there's a facility with 7 levels, and on those levels things are happening that we're not meant to understand. And the people who run it are counting on the fact that you'll never take this seriously enough to find out for yourself. Aloysius hits upload and watches the progress bar fill. His story joins thousands of others like it, indistinguishable from fiction, impossible to verify, easily dismissed. He closes his laptop and looks out at the Los Angeles skyline. Somewhere beneath the ground in New Mexico, machinery hums, research continues, agreements are honoured, and the world goes on, blissfully unaware or deliberately ignorant, he's no longer sure which. The truth isn't hidden, it's managed. And he's just become part of the management system, a cautionary tale about what happens when you dig too deep, packaged and presented in a way that ensures nobody else will make the same mistake. Elias Ford's investigation ends not with revelation, but with assimilation. He sought the truth. Instead, he became part of the mechanism that obscures it. Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where we dive deep into the mysteries that keep us awake at night. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to give a special thanks to DXD232 for this incredible video suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. Your suggestions fuel these late night journeys into the unknown. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories. It really helps us continue bringing you these haunting tales. Now, settle in as we explore what happens when family secrets and government conspiracies collide in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the truth. The rain drummed against the chapel windows like fingers tapping out Morse code, urgent, persistent, demanding attention. I sat in the front pew, staring at the flag-draped casket that held my grandfather, Colonel James Mitchell, United States Air Force, retired. The chaplain's words washed over me like white noise, meaningless platitudes about service and sacrifice that felt hollow in the echoing space. Grandpa Jim had always been a quiet man, the kind who could fill a room with his presence while saying nothing at all. His steel-grey eyes held secrets that I'd never been curious enough to ask about, and now those secrets were buried with him. Or so I thought. The military honour guard folded the flag with mechanical precision, each crease sharp enough to cut glass. When they handed it to me, the only family he had left, the weight of it seemed heavier than cloth and thread should be. 21 rifle shots cracked through the cemetery air, and I watched them lower my grandfather into the ground, taking with him 40 years of classified service that he'd never once discussed at family dinners. After the service, I stood alone by his grave as the other mourners drifted away like ghosts in the mist. Most were elderly veterans from his old squadron, men with weathered faces and knowing looks, who shook my hand with grips that still held strength despite their age. A few whispered condolences, but I noticed how they glanced at each other when they thought I wasn't looking. Shared glances that spoke of things unspoken. He was a good man, said one particularly ancient veteran, his chest heavy with decades of ribbons and medals, kept his promises right to the end. There was something in the way he said it, an emphasis that made me wonder what promises he meant. The house felt different when I returned. Emptier, yes, but also somehow expectant, as if it were holding its breath. Grandpa Jim had lived here for 30 years, ever since Grandma passed, and every corner held memories of weekend visits and summer vacations. But now those memories felt incomplete, like photographs with faces cut out. I spent the next few days making arrangements, contacting lawyers, sorting through paperwork, deciding what to keep and what to donate. It was during this methodical dismantling of a life that I found myself standing in his bedroom, looking up at the attic access panel I'd never paid attention to before. The wooden ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed up, flashlight in hand. The attic was exactly what you'd expect. Dusty boxes, old furniture covered in sheets, the detritus of a long life lived quietly. But as I moved deeper into the space, something caught my eye. In the far corner, beneath what looked like perfectly normal floorboards, there was a slight depression, as if the wood had been cut and replaced. My fingers found the edges easily once I knew what to look for. The section of flooring lifted away to reveal a hiding place that had been carefully constructed decades ago. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth like a treasure map from some childhood adventure, was a briefcase. It was military issue, the kind of hard-sided case that could survive a nuclear blast. The locks were old but well maintained, and they opened with a satisfying click when I worked the combination. Grandma's birthday, because of course it was. Inside, the briefcase was divided into neat compartments, each holding documents that made my hands shake as I lifted them out. Top Secret Majestic 12 was stamped across every page in red ink that had faded to the colour of dried blood. The papers were yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, as if time had forgotten they existed. Most were typed on letterheads I didn't recognise, organisations with names like Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program and Project Blue Book Special Studies Group. But it was the photograph that stopped my breathing entirely. 12 men in military uniforms and dark suits, standing in formation like they were posing for history. The setting looked official, some kind of government building with marble columns visible in the background. They all had the bearing of men accustomed to power, to making decisions that shaped the world from shadows. I recognised a few faces from history books: General Nathan Twining, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, officials whose names I'd heard in connection with early UFO investigations. But there in the back row, younger than the others and wearing an Air Force dress uniform, was my grandfather. The back of the photograph was annotated in careful handwriting. The Committee, 1952. Below that, in different ink and what looked like a different hand, J. Mitchell, inducted 1962, Project Doorway. I spent the next 3 hours reading everything in that briefcase, and each document pulled me deeper into a reality I'd never imagined. There were incident reports from radar stations across the southwest, describing objects that moved in ways that defied physics. Photographs of wreckage that looked like nothing I'd ever seen, metal that seemed to flow like liquid mercury, but held its shape like steel. Witness testimonies from pilots, air traffic controllers, and civilians who'd seen things in the sky that officially didn't exist. But the most unsettling document was a simple roster, typed on official letterhead from something called Majestic 12 Operations Command. 12 names were listed in alphabetical order, each followed by their service branch, rank, and what appeared to be a security clearance level that went beyond anything in the public domain. Most of the names I could research later: generals and admirals, a few scientists from Los Alamos and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, men who'd built America's military-industrial complex from the ground up. But one name, the 7th on the list, was completely blacked out with what looked like permanent marker. Even on a document that was clearly decades old, someone had taken the time to obscure that particular identity. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in my grandfather's distinctive script, was an addition: James R. Mitchell, Colonel, USAF, inducted March 15, 1962, clearance level, Umbra. The date meant something. 1962 was the year my father was born, the year my grandparents bought this house. It was when Grandpa Jim's career took a sudden upward trajectory that I'd never really questioned before. One day he was a squadron commander at a routine airbase. The next, he was being reassigned to positions that sounded important, but which he never talked about. Liaison work, he'd always said when I asked. Coordinating between different departments. Now I understood that his vague answers hadn't been modesty. They'd been security protocols. The more I read, the more questions multiplied. There were references to recovered materials and non-terrestrial technology. Meeting minutes discussed containment procedures and public information management. One particularly chilling memo, dated 1963, discussed the termination protocols for individuals who posed security risks to the program. But what disturbed me most was how recent some of the documents were. The briefcase contained papers dating all the way up to 1995, 3 years before my grandfather's official retirement. Whatever Majestic 12 was, it hadn't ended with the Cold War. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned each document to its place. The briefcase went back into its hiding spot, and I replaced the floorboard exactly as I'd found it. But even as I tried to restore normalcy, I knew there was no going back. The questions were already consuming me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my grandfather's guest room, my room now, I supposed, and stared at the ceiling while rain continued its Morse code against the windows. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Every sound might be footsteps from people who knew I'd found what I wasn't supposed to find. By morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. My friend Marcus worked as a contractor for the Department of Defense, something involving cybersecurity that he was deliberately vague about. We'd known each other since college, and I trusted him more than anyone else in my life. If anyone could help me understand what I'd found, it would be him. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those places that stayed busy enough to provide cover for conversation. I'd brought printouts of a few of the less sensitive documents, nothing that mentioned names or specific operations, just enough to give him context. Marcus studied the papers with the intensity of someone who knew what to look for. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he read, and when he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather's attic." "Marcus, is this real?" He glanced around the coffee shop, then leaned closer. "Do you have any idea what you're dealing with here? These classifications, I've never seen anything like them. Umbra clearance? That's not supposed to exist. But it does exist. That's the problem." He gathered the papers and handed them back to me. "Listen to me very carefully. Go home, burn these, and never mention them to anyone again." Marcus dash. "I'm serious. There are things the government doesn't want people to know, and there are things the government will kill people to keep secret. This feels like the second kind." His words should have scared me away. Instead, they had the opposite effect. The journalist in me, the part that had driven me to a career in investigative reporting before I'd settled into the comfortable mediocrity of freelance writing, suddenly awakened after years of dormancy. "What if I don't want to let this go?" Marcus stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Then you're on your own." And whatever happens next, we never had this conversation. He left his coffee unfinished and walked out, leaving me alone with questions that felt heavier than they had before. But I'd expected this reaction. Anyone who worked within the system would be trained to avoid anything that could compromise their clearance or their career. I needed to find someone who operated outside those constraints. I spent the afternoon researching Majestic 12 online, falling down rabbit holes that led to conspiracy forums, declassified documents, and academic papers about government secrecy. Most of what I found was speculation and fantasy, but scattered through the noise were threads of genuine research by people who dedicated their lives to uncovering the truth. That evening, I made my second mistake of the week. I called my friend Sarah, a journalist with connections throughout the intelligence community, and asked if she'd ever heard of anything called Majestic 12. The line went silent for so long that I thought the caller dropped. "Where are you hearing that name?" she finally asked. "It's probably nothing. Family history stuff. Meet me tomorrow, not at my office, somewhere public, and don't mention this to anyone else until we talk." The urgency in her voice should have been another warning. Instead, it felt like validation. I wasn't chasing shadows. I was onto something real. But I never made it to that meeting. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass. The house was dark, but something was wrong with the darkness. It felt occupied, as if invisible presence was moving through it. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. The landline was dead too. From somewhere below came the sound of footsteps, careful and deliberate. They moved through the house with purpose, as if the intruders knew exactly where they were going. I heard them climbing the stairs to the second floor, then the creak of the attic ladder being lowered. I hid in the bathroom and waited. The sounds from above were methodical, things being moved, floorboards being pried up, the briefcase being opened. They knew exactly where to look. 20 minutes later, the footsteps receded. I heard a vehicle start in the driveway, then fade into the distance. When I finally found the courage to investigate, the attic had been searched thoroughly, but not destructively. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was stolen. They'd simply examined everything and left. But they'd left something behind. On my kitchen table, weighted down by my grandfather's coffee mug, was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in the same font as the documents I'd found. Return what doesn't belong to you. No one will believe you anyway. The message was unsigned, but the implication was clear. They knew who I was, they knew what I'd found, and they were giving me a chance to walk away quietly. The old me, the careful, risk-averse me, might have taken that chance. But something had changed. Maybe it was reading those documents and realizing that my grandfather had spent decades keeping secrets that could reshape our understanding of reality. Maybe it was the casual way they'd invaded my home, as if my privacy and safety were irrelevant details. Or maybe it was the arrogance of that final line, "No one will believe you anyway." They were probably right, but I was going to try anyway. I found David Kellerman through a recommendation on a UFO research forum. He was a retired aerospace historian who'd spent 30 years studying the intersection of government secrecy and unexplained aerial phenomena. His academic credentials were impressive: MIT, CALTECH, positions with NASA and the RAND Corporation, but he'd sacrificed his mainstream career to pursue questions that his former colleagues considered career suicide. His office was in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a Chinese restaurant, a kind of anonymous location that suggested someone who valued privacy over prestige. The interior looked like a library had exploded. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with books, journals and filing boxes that seemed to follow an organisational system only he understood. Kellerman himself was exactly what I'd expected. 60s, grey-beard, eyes that held the intensity of someone who'd spent years looking for patterns that others missed. He poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration and settled behind a desk covered with documents. "You mentioned Majestic 12 on the phone," he said without preamble. "That's not a term people use casually." I pulled out the photograph I'd found and placed it on his desk. Kellerman's reaction was immediate and startling. He actually recoiled as if I'd shown him something dangerous. "Where did you get this?" "My grandfather's attic. He died last week." Kellerman studied the photo with a magnifying glass, his expression growing more troubled with each face he examined. "This is Jesus. Do you know who these people are?" "Some of them. General Twining, Admiral Hillenkoetter, the founding members of the most secret organisation in American history. These 12 men controlled information about unexplained aerial phenomena for decades. They decided what the public knew, what scientists could study, what pilots could report." He pointed to each face in turn, rattling off names and positions that painted a picture of a shadow organisation with connections throughout the military-industrial complex. But when he reached the man I'd identified as my grandfather, he paused. "I don't recognise this one." "That's unusual. I thought I knew all the confirmed MJ-12 members." "That's my grandfather, James Mitchell. The back says he was inducted in 1962. Kellerman flipped the photo over and read the notation. His face went pale. "Project Doorway. I've heard that name exactly once before, in a document that was leaked and then disappeared within hours. It was supposedly some kind of advanced research initiative, but nobody knows what they were researching." "What do you think they found?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "You really don't know, do you? Your grandfather never told you anything. He never talked about his work. Ever." Kellerman leaned back in his chair, studying me as if trying to determine how much truth I could handle. "The conventional wisdom is that MJ-12 was formed in 1947 to investigate the Roswell incident. But the evidence suggests they were actually created to manage something much bigger, a systematic recovery and study program for non-human technology." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Non-human technology. Even hearing it said out loud felt surreal. "You're talking about UFOs. I'm talking about recovered materials, reverse-engineered technology, and a cover-up that's lasted 75 years. He gestured toward the photograph. These men weren't just investigating unexplained aircraft. They were trying to understand technology that was decades or centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. And my grandfather was part of this. If this photograph is authentic, then your grandfather was inducted into the most classified program in human history. Project Doorway might have been where they kept their most sensitive research, the things too dangerous or too revolutionary to share with the rest of MJ-12. Kellerman stood and moved to one of his filing cabinets, retrieving a folder thick with documents and photographs. "I need you to understand something. The people who ran this program didn't just classify information. They eliminated threats. Researchers who asked too many questions disappeared. Witnesses were discredited or worse. Talking about this publicly could put you on lists you don't want to be on. Someone already broke into my house. They know I have this." His expression darkened. "Then you're already on the list. The question is what you're going to do about it." I thought about my grandfather's life of careful silence, about all the questions I'd never asked, and all the answers I'd never received. Then I thought about that arrogant note left on my kitchen table, the casual assumption that I could be intimidated into compliance. "I want to know the truth. All of it." Kellerman nodded slowly as if he'd expected this answer. "Then we're going to need help. There are others, researchers, former military personnel, people who've been asking the same questions you're asking. But we'll need to be careful. The moment you start connecting dots publicly, they'll move to shut you down. How? However they need to. These people have resources you can't imagine and authorization you don't want to think about. But there might be a way to get ahead of them, if you're willing to take the risk." Over the next 2 hours, Kellerman outlined a plan that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. Instead of trying to investigate MJ-12 from the outside, we would use the documents I'd found to force them into the open. By releasing carefully selected information through multiple channels simultaneously, we could create too many fires for them to contain at once. "The key," he explained, "is making sure the information spreads faster than they can respond. Once it's out there, they can't put it back in the bottle. It was a good plan. It might even have worked. But we never got the chance to find out." I spent the next morning at Kellerman's office, helping him scan and catalogue every document from my grandfather's briefcase. We worked methodically, creating multiple backup copies and preparing a release package that would be impossible to suppress completely. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Simultaneous uploads to WikiLeaks, multiple UFO research organisations, and several mainstream journalists who'd shown interest in government transparency issues. Kellerman had contacts throughout the UFO research community, people who'd spent years waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. Within hours, we had confirmation that major research organisations were prepared to receive and distribute the documents. Everything was in place. At 3 p.m, I uploaded the complete document package to an encrypted file-sharing service that Kellerman had used successfully for previous leaks. The upload took 47 minutes, hundreds of pages of classified documents that would finally expose the truth about decades of government deception. For exactly 12 hours, I felt like we were winning. I woke up the next morning to a house without power, internet or phone service. The silence was so complete that it took me several minutes to realise what was wrong. No humming refrigerator, no digital clocks, no background noise from electronic devices. It was as if someone had cut the house off from the modern world entirely. Outside my bedroom window, a black SUV sat at the curb with its engine running. As I watched, a second vehicle pulled up behind it. Men in dark suits got out and began setting up some kind of equipment, dishes and antennas that suggested sophisticated surveillance technology. My phone had no signal, but its battery was mysteriously drained despite being plugged in overnight. The landline was completely dead. I was effectively isolated from the outside world, but I wasn't quite ready to panic yet. This could still be intimidation rather than preparation for something worse. That illusion lasted until I tried to check the file-sharing site using my neighbour's Wi-Fi. The documents were gone. In their place was a message that made my blood turn cold. You are now under protective surveillance for your own safety. Do not attempt to leave the area or contact outside parties until you have been debriefed. Protective surveillance. As if kidnapping became legal when the government did it. I tried every backup plan Kellerman and I had discussed. Multiple file-sharing sites, email accounts, social media platforms. Every avenue we'd prepared had been somehow compromised or blocked. It was as if an invisible hand had reached into the internet and selectively deleted only the information we'd tried to share. The technical sophistication required for that kind of operation was staggering. It wasn't enough to monitor internet traffic. They had to have real-time access to multiple private servers and the ability to alter or delete data across platforms simultaneously. The resources required suggested an operation far beyond normal law enforcement or even typical intelligence agencies. By noon, I was completely cut off. The men outside had set up a perimeter that looked professional, but not overtly threatening. More like a protective detail than an arrest team. But the message was clear. I wasn't leaving until someone decided I could leave. I spent the afternoon trying to understand what I was dealing with. Whoever these people were, they had capabilities that seemed to transcend normal government authority. They could shut down utilities, manipulate internet infrastructure, and coordinate surveillance operations without any visible oversight or legal process. But they'd also gone to elaborate lengths to avoid direct confrontation. The message had called it protective surveillance, and their behaviour suggested they wanted cooperation rather than conflict. That meant they needed something from me, information, compliance, or something else I couldn't yet identify. At 6 p.m, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole to see a woman in a dark business suit alone, holding what appeared to be an official government identification. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Most importantly, she didn't look like the kind of person who would kick down doors or make threats. "Mr. Mitchell," she said when I opened the door, "my name is Agent Elizabeth Morrison, and I represent a group that worked very closely with your grandfather. We need to talk." Agent Morrison's credentials identified her as working for something called Advanced Special Programs Division, which meant nothing to me but seemed genuine enough. She declined to come inside, suggesting instead that we take a drive to somewhere more secure for our conversation. "More secure for whom?" I asked. "For everyone involved. Your house is being monitored by multiple parties now, and not all of them have your best interests at heart." The statement was cryptic enough to be either a threat or a warning. Against my better judgment, I decided to trust her. Maybe it was her professional demeanour, or maybe I was simply tired of being trapped in my own home, but something about Agent Morrison seemed different from the faceless surveillance team that had been watching me. We drove in her unmarked sedan through the suburbs and then out into the desert, following highways that grew progressively emptier as we moved away from civilization. Morrison didn't speak during the drive, and I found myself studying her profile, trying to read intent in the set of her jaw and the way she gripped the steering wheel. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. "To see something your grandfather helped build." After 2 hours of driving, we turned off the main highway onto a dirt road that looked like it led nowhere. But after several miles of desert scrub and Joshua trees, a chain-link fence appeared in the distance, topped with razor wire and surrounded by warning signs about restricted military areas. The facility beyond the fence looked abandoned. Old buildings with broken windows, a few rusted antenna arrays, and what might once have been a radar installation. It looked like dozens of other Cold War-era installations scattered throughout the southwest, the kind of place that had been built quickly and abandoned just as quickly when budgets shifted or missions changed. But appearances were deceiving. Agent Morrison used a key card to open gates that looked rusty but operated smoothly, and I noticed that despite the apparent abandonment, the roads were well maintained and the power lines were clearly active. "What is this place?" Officially, a decommissioned early warning station that was closed in 1967. Unofficially, it's been continuously operational for 58 years. She parked in front of the largest building and led me to an entrance that was hidden from casual view. Your grandfather spent a lot of time here in the 1960s and 70s. The interior was a revelation. Beyond the facade of abandonment was a facility that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Clean corridors with modern lighting, security checkpoints with advanced scanning equipment, and an elevator that descended far deeper than should have been possible in a desert installation. "Welcome to Site 7, Morrison said as the elevator continued its descent. "One of 12 facilities where we study materials that don't officially exist." The elevator opened onto a vast underground complex that stretched in multiple directions. The architecture was utilitarian but clearly expensive. Reinforced concrete, climate control systems, and security measures that suggested whatever was stored here was extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. Morrison led me through corridors lined with laboratories and storage areas, past rooms filled with equipment I couldn't identify, and technicians who barely looked up from their work. The scale of the operation was staggering. This wasn't a small research facility, it was an entire underground city dedicated to purposes I couldn't yet comprehend. "How long has this been here?" "Construction began in 1953, expanded continuously ever since. Your grandfather was one of the original planners. We stopped at a massive vault door that required multiple security protocols to open. Morrison used her keycard, submitted to a retinal scan, and entered a code that was at least 12 digits long. When the door finally opened, I found myself staring into a storage facility that looked like a combination warehouse and museum. The space was filled with display cases, each containing objects that challenged my understanding of physics and engineering. Metal fragments that seemed to shift colour as I watched them. Circuits printed on substrates that looked organic rather than synthetic. Components that hummed with energy despite having no visible power source. "Recovered materials," Morrison explained simply. "Things we've found at crash sites over the past 70 years. I approached the nearest display case and found myself looking at what appeared to be a piece of hull material from some kind of aircraft. But the metal, if it was metal, seemed to flow like liquid while maintaining a solid form. As I watched, patterns appeared and disappeared on its surface, as if it were responding to my presence. What am I looking at? Technology that's decades ahead of anything humans have developed. Materials that don't follow our understanding of physics. Engineering principles we still can't fully comprehend. Case after case contained similar impossible objects. Fragments of machinery that operated on principles beyond current science. Alloys that shouldn't exist. Components that seemed to generate power from nothing. It was a museum of impossibility. Proof that someone or something had solved technological challenges that humanity was still struggling to understand. But it was the far wall that stopped my breathing entirely. A grid of black and white photographs covered the entire surface. Dozens of images showing crash sites from around the world. Some I recognised from UFO research. Roswell, of course. But also incidents I'd read about in declassified Air Force documents. Others were completely unfamiliar, showing recovery operations in locations ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical forests. Each photograph was labelled with a date, location, and classification number. The dates ranged from 1947 to just last year, suggesting that whatever was crashing wasn't a historical curiosity but an ongoing phenomenon. 75 years, Morrison said quietly. 75 years of recovered materials, and we're still trying to understand how they work. Who built them? That's the question your grandfather spent his career trying to answer. I was studying a particularly clear photograph of what looked like a disc-shaped craft being loaded onto a military trailer when I heard footsteps behind us. Multiple sets of boots on concrete, moving with military precision. "I'm afraid that's all the time we have for the tour," Morrison said, her tone suddenly formal and apologetic. I turned to see 6 soldiers in combat gear entering the vault, weapons lowered but ready. Unlike the surveillance team at my house, these men wore full military uniforms with unit patches I didn't recognise. "Hands where we can see them," their leader commanded, though his tone was professional rather than threatening. I raised my hands slowly, trying to process what was happening. Agent Morrison? But Morrison was backing away, her expression genuinely regretful. I'm sorry. I was hoping we could resolve this differently, but the decision has been made at levels above my authority. The soldiers surrounded me without violence, clearly following protocols for handling a cooperative subject. But as they guided me toward the exit, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. On the wall of photographs in the bottom right corner was an image I hadn't noticed before. It showed a crash site that looked recent, emergency vehicles, military personnel, and in the background a house that looked suspiciously familiar. My grandfather's house. My house. The photograph was dated 3 days ago, the day after I'd found the briefcase in the attic. They didn't arrest me, but they didn't let me go either. Instead, I found myself in what could generously be called a conference room, but which felt more like an interrogation chamber. Windowless walls, a metal table, and chairs that were designed for function rather than comfort. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to understand how my search for truth had led to detention in an underground government facility. When the door finally opened, the man who entered looked exactly like what Hollywood would cast as a government spook. Mid-50s, greying hair, expensive suit that managed to look both formal and threatening. He carried a manila folder and moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected other people's lives. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "My name is Director William Hayes. I represent the organisation your grandfather served for over 30 years. He opened the folder and withdrew a photograph, the same one I'd found in my grandfather's briefcase, showing 12 men in military uniforms and suits. But this copy was different. Instead of my grandfather's handwritten notation on the back, this version had an official stamp and classification marking. Majestic 12, Hayes continued, was never what people thought it was. It wasn't 12 men making decisions about UFO policy. It was 12 seats, positions that have been continuously filled by individuals with specific skills and clearances, and my grandfather held one of those seats. The 12th seat specifically. Your grandfather was recruited in 1962 because of his expertise in aerospace engineering and his security clearance, but also because of his psychological profile. We needed someone who could compartmentalize information and work on projects that challenge conventional understanding of reality. Hayes withdrew another document from the folder, a psychological evaluation with my grandfather's name and photograph. The assessment was thorough and unsettling, analysing everything from his cognitive abilities to his likelihood of developing moral objections to classified work. Project Doorway was your grandfather's primary assignment, Hayes explained. While the rest of MJ-12 focused on recovery and analysis of materials, Doorway was tasked with practical application, taking recovered technology and developing human applications. You're talking about reverse engineering? I'm talking about the most advanced research program in human history. Integrated circuits, fibre optics, advanced metallurgy, dozens of technologies that revolutionized human civilization were actually derived from materials we recovered starting in 1947. The implications were staggering. If Hayes was telling the truth, then much of modern technology wasn't the result of human innovation, but rather reverse-engineered alien science. Our computers, our communications, our material science, all of it built on a foundation of borrowed knowledge. Why are you telling me this? Because Majestic 12 never disbanded. It evolved. Hayes leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. Government programs have limitations, oversight, budgets, political interference, but private organisations can operate with greater flexibility and fewer restrictions. You went private. We became self-sustaining. The technologies we developed generated revenue streams that funded continued research. By 1995, we were completely independent of government oversight or funding. It made a certain perverse sense. If you could reverse engineer advanced technology, you could patent and license innovations that would generate enormous profits. Those profits could fund more research, more recovery operations, more technological advancement, a self-perpetuating cycle of discovery and development that operated outside normal economic and political constraints. The question, Hayes continued, is what happens now? Your investigation has attracted attention from multiple parties, some friendly, others less so. You have a choice to make. He placed 2 items on the table between us. The first was a standard non-disclosure agreement, the kind of legal document that would bind me to silence about everything I'd seen and learned. The second was a keycard similar to the one Agent Morrison had used to access the facility. Option 1, you sign the NDA, agree never to discuss or investigate this matter further, and return to your normal life. We'll ensure your safety and provide compensation for any inconvenience you've experienced. And option 2, you take the keycard and accept an invitation to join the organisation your grandfather served. The 12th seat has been vacant since his death 3 days ago. The offer was so unexpected that I couldn't immediately process it. You want me to become part of the cover-up? I want you to become part of the solution. Hayes' expression didn't change, but his tone became more urgent. Do you think we've spent 75 years hiding this technology for fun? Do you think we enjoy keeping scientific breakthroughs locked away in underground vaults? Then why do it? Because releasing it too quickly would destabilize human civilization. Imagine if we'd introduced integrated circuit technology in 1950, or revealed anti-gravity principles in 1960. The economic, political and social disruption would have been catastrophic. Hayes stood and moved to a wall-mounted display that I hadn't noticed before. With the touch of a button, it came alive with charts and graphs showing technological advancement over the past century. We've been carefully introducing recovered technology into human civilization for decades, he explained. Each innovation is timed to coincide with humanity's ability to understand and integrate it safely. We're not suppressing progress, we're managing it. The display showed a timeline that was both fascinating and disturbing. Major technological breakthroughs that I'd assumed were human achievements were actually marked as controlled releases of recovered technology. The transistor, laser technology, stealth aircraft design, all of it apparently derived from non-human sources, but introduced gradually to avoid societal shock. Your grandfather understood this, Hayes continued. He spent 30 years helping us determine what humanity was ready to know and when they were ready to know it. The 12th seat has always been responsible for this delicate balance. And if I refuse both options? Hayes returned to his chair and for the first time his professional composure slipped slightly. Then you become a security risk that needs to be managed. We prefer cooperation, but we will protect this program by any means necessary. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. I could join them, be silenced by legal agreement, or be silenced by other means. But there was something else in his expression, a hope that I would choose cooperation over coercion. I need time to think. Time is a luxury we don't have. Your investigation has already attracted attention from foreign intelligence services and radical transparency groups. Every hour you remain uncommitted increases the risk of exposure. Hayes withdrew one final document from his folder, an intelligence briefing that showed my photograph alongside analysis of my online activities, social connections and potential security risks. They'd been watching me far longer than I'd realised, probably since the moment I'd mentioned Majestic 12 to Marcus. If you accept the position, you'll have access to technologies that could revolutionise human understanding of physics, energy and space travel. You'll be part of the most important scientific endeavour in history. And if I try to expose what I've learned, then you'll join a long list of people who tried to reveal secrets they didn't understand. Some were discredited, others simply disappeared. A few suffered more creative fates. The casual way he mentioned murder made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to consider the offer objectively. If everything Hayes had told me was true, if there really was recovered non-human technology being slowly integrated into human civilization, then perhaps controlled disclosure was better than chaos. But there was something about the entire setup that felt wrong. The underground facility, the private organisation operating without oversight, the casual threats against anyone who might expose the truth. Even if their intentions were good, the methods felt like something from a totalitarian nightmare. What happened to the other 11 seats? They're still filled. The organisation has evolved, but the structure remains the same. 12 individuals with different specialties working together to manage humanity's relationship with non-terrestrial intelligence. Non-terrestrial intelligence? You're admitting these materials came from aliens." Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the room, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Mr. Mitchell, that's the least shocking thing you'll learn if you accept this position." I made my decision at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, sitting in my grandfather's kitchen and staring at the key card Director Hayes had given me. They'd returned me to my house with a 12-hour deadline, promising that my choice would be final and irreversible. The surveillance team was still outside, but their presence had shifted from threatening to protective. Agent Morrison had stopped by earlier to explain that foreign intelligence services were now actively searching for me, having detected the brief leak of classified documents. Whether I joined the organisation or simply signed an NDA, I would need their protection. I'd spent hours reading everything I could find about my grandfather's military service, looking for clues about the man who'd kept such enormous secrets for so many years. His commendations were impressive but vague, full of references to special projects and classified contributions to national security. Between the lines, I could see the outline of a man who'd struggled with the weight of knowledge he couldn't share. There was a journal I'd found in his desk, mostly mundane entries about daily life and family events, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that made more sense now that I understood his real work. "Made progress on the translation project today," he'd written in 1968. "The mathematics are unlike anything we've seen before." Translation project, as if he'd been trying to understand instructions written in a non-human language. The most revealing entry was from 1985. 23 years of this work, and I still don't know if we're preparing humanity for the future or betraying it to forces we don't understand, but the alternative, chaos, panic, the collapse of everything we've built, seems worse than continuing down this path. My grandfather had wrestled with the same choice I was facing now. Join a conspiracy that might be protecting humanity, or risk exposing truths that could destroy the foundations of human civilization. At 4 a.m, I made my choice. I walked to my front door and opened it slowly. Agent Morrison was waiting on the porch, as if she'd known this moment would come. "Have you decided?" she asked. I looked at the key card in my hand, then at the surveillance vehicles that had become as familiar as the landscape. Beyond them, the desert stretched toward mountains that looked like sleeping giants in the pre-dawn darkness. "My grandfather kept these secrets for 30 years, I said finally. "How did he live with it?" He understood that some truths are too dangerous for democracy to handle, but that doesn't mean they should be hidden forever, just managed carefully until humanity is ready. "And you think I'm ready to make those decisions?" Morrison's expression was genuinely sympathetic. "I think you're the only one who can. Your grandfather chose you for this role long before you found that briefcase. Why do you think he kept it where you would find it after his death?" The implication hit me like cold water. The briefcase hadn't been hidden from me. It had been preserved for me. My grandfather had spent his final years preparing for this moment, when his secrets would become my responsibility. "The 12th seat," I said quietly. "Welcome to Majestic 12, Mr. Mitchell." I handed her the key card, then walked back into the house that now felt like someone else's life. In 12 hours, I would report to Site 7 for orientation and briefing. I would learn about technologies that shouldn't exist, about contact with intelligences that weren't human, about decisions that shape the future of human civilization. But first, I had one final task to complete. I sat at my grandfather's desk and opened a new document on my laptop. If I was going to join the conspiracy, I was going to document everything I could remember about the journey that brought me here. Not for publication, I understood now that some secrets had to be kept, but for the person who would someday find themselves in my position. Because there would always be a 12th seat, and it would always need to be filled by someone willing to bear the weight of impossible knowledge. I began typing, "If you're reading this, then you found what I left for you to find." The briefcase was just the beginning. What follows is the real story, the one they don't tell you until after you've already agreed to carry it forward. Outside, the sun was rising over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. It looked like the dawn of a new world, which I supposed it was, at least for me. 3 months later, I was sitting in a conference room beneath Site 7. surrounded by 11 other people who'd made the same choice I had made. We were reviewing intelligence reports about a crash in northern Canada, discussing recovery protocols and containment procedures with the casual professionalism of people who'd spent years managing the impossible. The work was exactly as advertised. Fascinating, terrifying, and absolutely necessary. Every day brought new evidence that humanity was not alone in the universe, and every day brought new decisions about how much of that truth the world was ready to handle. I thought about my grandfather often, wondering if he'd felt the same mix of pride and guilt that consumed me now. We were guardians of humanity's future, protectors of civilization's stability, and keepers of secrets that could transform or destroy everything humans had built. But late at night, when I returned to the house that now felt more like a museum than a home, I sometimes wondered about the road not taken. What if I had chosen transparency over secrecy? What if I had tried to tell the world about recovered technology and non-human intelligence? Would humanity have been ready for that truth? Or would it have torn apart the fabric of civilization, just as Director Hayes had warned? I supposed I would never know. But every morning I woke up and chose to believe that gradual disclosure was better than sudden chaos, that managed truth was better than devastating revelation. After all, that's what the 12th seat was for, to make the hard choices so others didn't have to. And if someday I was wrong, if the secrecy caused more harm than transparency would have, well, hopefully the person who inherited my position would be wiser than I had been. The briefcase was waiting in the attic, exactly where my grandfather had left it, exactly where I would leave it when my time came, along with a letter that began, "If you're reading this, then you found what I left for you to find." Some traditions, it seemed, were worth preserving, even the secret ones. A massive thank you to Vortex9119 for this incredible video suggestion. If you have story ideas you'd like to see brought to life, drop them in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these immersive tales, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between mystery and reality. What if I told you that buried beneath a 1,000-year-old chapel in Ethiopia lies something so powerful that governments have spent decades ensuring you never learn about it? What if every conflict, every war, every uprising in that region wasn't random chaos, but a response to something ancient awakening? My name is Alex Morrison, and 3 months ago, I was just another satellite imaging technician, analysing ground-penetrating radar for a living. Now I'm hiding in a cabin in rural Montana, and I may be the only person alive who knows the truth about what's really buried in Axum. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway. That's what you do when you're 3 weeks behind on satellite analysis reports, and your supervisor keeps sending those passive-aggressive emails with red exclamation points. I was a field technician for Orbital Dynamics, a mid-tier satellite imaging company that contracted with everyone from agricultural firms to mining corporations. My job was simple: analyse ground-penetrating radar scans, identify subsurface anomalies and file reports. Nothing glamorous, nothing dangerous, just data. The Horn of Africa cluster had been sitting on my desk for 2 days. Standard geological survey for a potential infrastructure project in Ethiopia. Roads, power lines, The usual development stuff that required knowing what lay beneath the surface. I'd already processed 47 grids of unremarkable sediment layers and bedrock formations when I opened grid 48. The image loaded pixel by pixel, revealing the familiar topography of northern Ethiopia. Rolling hills, scattered vegetation, and the ancient town of Axum with its towering obelisks and stone churches. But there, beneath the church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, was something that made my breath catch in my throat. A perfect geometric void. Not a cave, not a natural formation. The radar signature showed clean, straight edges forming a rectangular shape, approximately 4 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep. The dimensions were so precise they could have been cut with industrial equipment, yet the surrounding rock layers indicated this void had existed for centuries, possibly millennia. I pulled up the analysis protocols on my second monitor. Standard procedure for unexplained anomalies was clear. Mark as geological inconsistency or data corruption, and move on. The company didn't pay us to solve mysteries, just to identify potential construction hazards. But those dimensions nagged at me. 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. I'd heard those measurements before, in some half-remembered history class or documentary. Something biblical. I saved the image to my personal drive before marking the official report as data corruption. Recommend resurvey. My supervisor would approve it without a second glance, and the client would order new scans of the area that would somehow never quite capture that same perfect void again. As I prepared to move on to the next grid, I noticed something else in the metadata. The thermal overlay showed heat signatures throughout the scan area, solar absorption on the surface, geothermal activity deeper down, all normal patterns, except for the void. The void was 3 degrees warmer than the surrounding rock despite being completely enclosed. Dead objects don't generate heat. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, but no amount of analysis could explain what I was looking at. Finally, I closed the file and went home, but the image followed me. Those perfect dimensions, that impossible heat signature, the way it sat directly beneath one of Christianity's most sacred sites. 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. The traditional dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant. That night, I dreamed of golden cherubim with wings spread wide, and a voice that spoke from between them with the sound of rushing water. In the dream, I was standing in a stone chamber, lit by a light that cast no shadows, reaching toward a box that hummed with power. The moment my fingers touched the gold, I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just my imagination running wild after a long day staring at radar scans. But when I checked my phone, I found I'd been unconsciously searching for information about Axum, about the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, about ancient artifacts hidden beneath holy ground. The next morning I couldn't focus on anything else. I pulled up the scan again, studying every pixel, every thermal gradient, every impossible detail of that buried void. This wasn't data corruption. This was something real, something significant, something that had been deliberately hidden from the world. Something that was waiting. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Ethiopia. I'd convinced my supervisor that the Axum anomaly required ground truthing, a field verification to ensure our radar systems were functioning correctly. The company approved the trip because it sounded technical and responsible, not because I'd spent every spare moment researching the legend of the Ark's journey from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. According to tradition, the Queen of Sheba took the Ark back to Ethiopia after her visit to King Solomon. Her son, Menelik I, founded the Ethiopian Empire and established Axum as its capital. For 3,000 years, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians had claimed the true Ark of the Covenant rested in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, guarded by a single monk who could never leave the sacred precinct. Tourist nonsense, I'd always assumed. Every culture claimed to have some piece of biblical history hidden in their backyard. But now I had radar evidence of something buried exactly where the legend said it would be. Something that matched the Ark's traditional dimensions and somehow generated heat despite being entombed in solid rock. I landed in Addis Ababa on a Tuesday morning and caught a domestic flight to Axum the same day. The town was smaller than I'd expected, a collection of low buildings scattered around the famous obelisk park and the twin churches that claim to house the world's greatest religious relic. Tourists wandered between the ancient stone monuments, taking selfies with 3,000-year-old carved pillars, while guides recited well-practiced speeches about Queen Sheba and King Solomon. I hired a local guide named Dawit, a middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and careful English who specialised in the historical sites. We spent the first day touring the obelisk park and the ruins of ancient palaces, but I was really just getting a feel for the area, trying to match the topography to my radar scans. "Tomorrow we visit the churches," Dawit said as we walked back to my hotel. "The old church and the new church. Very sacred places." "Can tourists go inside both churches?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "The new church, yes. Beautiful paintings, ancient books, many treasures. But the old church..." He paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "The old church is different. Only priests allowed inside and the guardian." "The guardian? One monk, chosen for life. He watches over the..." Dawit lowered his voice. "Over what is kept there. He can never leave the church grounds. Never. He stays until he dies, then another is chosen." We'd reached my hotel, but I wasn't ready to end the conversation. "What exactly is he guarding?" Dawit looked uncomfortable. "Christians say it is the Tablet, the Ark of Moses. Others say it is just tradition, just stories. But I have lived in Axum all my life, and I tell you this, the guardian is real. I have seen him walking in the church courtyard at night, always alone, always watching." "What does he look like?" "Old, but not in years. Old in ... Dawit struggled for the word. "Old in soul. Like a man who has seen too much, carries too much weight. His eyes..." He shuddered. "I do not like to look at his eyes." That night I lay in bed studying satellite photos of the church complex on my laptop. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion was actually two buildings. A newer church built in the 1960s where tourists and worshippers could visit, and a smaller, older chapel that supposedly housed the Ark. The older building sat directly above the void I detected in the radar scan. According to everything I'd read, no outsider had been permitted inside the chapel in centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained absolute secrecy about what was housed there, allowing only the guardian and select high-ranking clergy to enter. Even the country's government respected the restriction, treating the chapel as sovereign territory beyond their jurisdiction. But tomorrow, I'd at least be able to see the building from the outside, maybe get close enough to take some thermal readings with the handheld scanner I'd brought. It wasn't much, but it might help me understand what was generating that heat signature 12 feet below ground. The next morning, Dawit led me through Axum's narrow streets toward the church complex. We passed market stalls selling coffee and spices, elderly women spinning cotton on wooden wheels, children playing soccer with a ball made of rags. Normal life in a normal town that happened to claim possession of humanity's most powerful religious artifact. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion compound was surrounded by a high stone wall with an ornate gate. Beyond the entrance I could see the modern church with its painted dome and arched windows, and behind that, partially hidden by trees, the smaller chapel that supposedly housed the Ark. "We can tour the new church," Dawit explained as we approached the gate. "Beautiful interior, many ancient paintings and manuscripts, but the chapel behind it..." He pointed to the smaller building. "That is forbidden." We passed through the gate into a courtyard filled with pilgrims and tourists. The modern church was indeed impressive, with colourful frescoes covering every wall and elaborate religious artefacts displayed in glass cases. But I found myself constantly glancing toward the windows that faced the restricted chapel, trying to catch a glimpse of the building that sat above my mysterious void. After an hour of dutifully admiring religious art, I excused myself to use the restroom, then slipped outside into the courtyard. The restricted chapel was maybe 50 yards away, separated from the public area by a low fence and some carefully placed shrubs. I walked casually in that direction, pulling out my phone as if taking pictures of the church architecture. The chapel was older than the main building, constructed from rough stone blocks that had been weathered smooth by centuries of highland rain. Small, narrow windows pierced the walls at regular intervals, but they were too high and too dark to see inside. The building's footprint was roughly 30 feet by 40 feet, large enough to house a small congregation, or to contain something that required a significant amount of protective space. As I was trying to estimate the building's exact position relative to my radar scan, a figure appeared in one of the windows. The Guardian. Even from 50 yards away I could see that Dowett hadn't exaggerated. The man's face was gaunt to the point of being skeletal, his skin pale as parchment despite Ethiopia's intense sun. But it was his eyes that made my breath catch, dark, hollow, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age, eyes that had seen something no human should see, carried some weight that was slowly crushing the life out of him. For a long moment we stared at each other across the courtyard. Then the Guardian raised one thin hand and made a clear gesture. Go away. Not a casual dismissal, but an urgent warning, the kind of motion you'd make to stop someone from stepping into traffic. As I watched, his lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. You don't want what's inside. Then he disappeared from the window, leaving me standing in the courtyard with my heart hammering and my thermal scanner forgotten in my pocket. The Guardian hadn't just been warning me away from the chapel. He'd been warning me away from whatever was buried beneath it, whatever was generating that impossible heat signature 12 feet underground. Whatever had been slowly killing him with its proximity for however many years he'd been trapped in that building. I found Dowett waiting by the main church entrance, looking concerned. You saw him, he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Then you understand why I do not like to look at his eyes. Come, we should go. There are other sights to see, happier places. But as we left the church compound, I couldn't stop thinking about that desperate gesture, that silent warning. The Guardian knew something was down there, something that had been affecting him for years, possibly decades, something that pulsed with heat and waited in the darkness beneath ancient stone. That night I called my supervisor and extended my stay in Ethiopia by a week. Back in my hotel room, I spread out printed satellite photos across the bed and fired up my laptop. The thermal scanner I'd brought was designed for surface readings, useless for penetrating 12 feet of stone and earth, but I had access to something better. Orbital Dynamics' complete archive of satellite data for the region. If the object beneath the chapel was generating heat, that heat had to go somewhere. And if I was right about what was down there, the heat generation might not be constant. I started with our company's historical scans of Axum, going back 15 years to when we first began regular coverage of the Horn of Africa. The early images showed the same thermal patterns I'd seen in the recent scan. Solar absorption, geothermal activity, normal ground temperatures, but the void beneath the chapel was already 3 degrees warmer than its surroundings, even in the oldest images. 15 years of continuous heat generation. Whatever was down there wasn't running on batteries. I pulled up the metadata for each scan, looking for variations in the thermal signature over time. For the first few years, the readings were remarkably consistent. 3 degrees above ambient, no significant fluctuation. Then, starting in 2010, the pattern began to change. Small spikes at first, maybe half a degree increases that lasted for a few days before returning to baseline. But as I worked forward through the data, the spikes became more frequent and more intense. By 2018, I was seeing heat surges of 6 to 8 degrees above normal, sometimes lasting for weeks. The most recent scan, the one that had started this whole investigation, showed the highest readings yet. Nearly 12 degrees above the surrounding rock temperature, sustained over the 3-day period when the satellite had passed over the region. I sat back, staring at the data visualization on my screen. The heat signature wasn't just evidence that something was buried beneath the chapel. It was evidence that something was becoming more active, more powerful, more awake. But what could cause those kinds of fluctuations? I needed to correlate the thermal spikes with external events, see if there was a pattern I was missing. I opened a new browser window and started searching for news archives covering Ethiopia and the surrounding region. Wars, natural disasters, political upheavals. anything that might correspond to the dates when the thermal readings spiked. The first major heat spike had occurred in September 2010. I cross-referenced the date and found coverage of renewed fighting in South Sudan, just a few hundred miles from Axum. Border clashes, civilian casualties, the usual litany of African conflict. The heat signature had jumped to 6 degrees above normal and stayed there for 2 weeks. December 2014, another spike, this one lasting almost a month. I found reports of protests in Ethiopia's Oromia region that had turned violent, with government forces killing dozens of demonstrators. The thermal readings had peaked at 8 degrees above normal. March 2019, the biggest spike yet, nearly 10 degrees above ambient temperature. Major fighting had erupted between Ethiopia and Eritrea along their shared border, the worst violence in years between the two countries. Thousands of troops mobilized, artillery exchanges, threats of full-scale war. The pattern was undeniable. Every time conflict erupted in the region, the object beneath the chapel became more active. Not just reactive, but almost anticipatory. Some of the thermal spikes had begun days or even weeks before the first news reports of violence. I leaned back in the hotel room's uncomfortable chair, trying to process what the data was telling me. If the Ark of the Covenant was really buried beneath that chapel, and if it was somehow responding to regional conflicts, what did that mean? According to biblical accounts, the Ark had been a weapon, used by the Israelites to destroy their enemies and part the Jordan River. But those were just stories, weren't they? Ancient myths to explain natural phenomena or military victories. Except now I had 15 years of satellite data suggesting those stories might have been more literal than anyone imagined. I opened a new search window and typed in Ark of the Covenant Biblical Powers. The results were a mixture of scholarly articles, religious websites, and conspiracy theories, but certain themes appeared consistently. The Ark as a communication device between God and Moses. The Ark as a weapon capable of destroying armies. The Ark as a source of divine power that killed anyone who touched it improperly. One academic paper caught my attention. Electromagnetic Anomalies in Biblical Texts, a technical analysis of the Ark narrative. The author, a physicist from MIT, had attempted to explain the Ark's described effects in terms of advanced technology rather than divine intervention. According to his analysis, the biblical descriptions were consistent with some kind of high-energy, electromagnetic device, possibly using principles that modern science was only beginning to understand. The paper was 8 years old and had been largely ignored by mainstream academia, but its conclusions were fascinating. If the Ark contained technology rather than divine presence, technology based on electromagnetic manipulation of space-time, then its effects on local conflicts might be measurable, predictable, even controllable. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but I wasn't tired. I had 15 years of data to analyse, patterns to uncover, connections to make. If I was right about what was happening, the implications went far beyond archaeological discovery. This was about a weapon that had been influencing regional conflicts for decades, maybe centuries, sitting 12 feet beneath a chapel in northern Ethiopia, a weapon that was becoming more active. I pulled up the most recent thermal readings again, studying the heat signature that had triggered this entire investigation. 12 degrees above ambient temperature, the highest reading yet. And according to the news feeds I'd been monitoring, tensions were rising again along the Ethiopia-Eritrea border. Troop movements, diplomatic protests, the same warning signs that had preceded every previous spike in the thermal data. If the pattern held, the heat signature beneath the chapel would spike again within days, and somewhere in the Horn of Africa, people would start dying. I saved all my analysis to an encrypted drive and uploaded backup copies to 3 different cloud storage services. Whatever was happening in Axum, I was probably the only person outside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church who understood the connection between the buried object and regional violence. The only person who could prove that the Ark of the Covenant wasn't just a religious relic, but an active weapon that had been shaping the history of East Africa for 3 millennia. The only person who might be able to stop it. I had a contact at the Vatican Archives, someone I'd met at a conference on satellite archaeology 3 years earlier. Elena Rossi was a researcher specializing in the historical verification of biblical sites, and she had access to documents that most scholars could only dream of seeing. If anyone could tell me what the Catholic Church knew about the Ethiopian claims regarding the Ark, it would be her. I drafted a carefully worded email describing my satellite findings in technical terms, without mentioning my theories about the thermal correlations with regional conflicts. I presented it as an archaeological question. Had the Vatican ever investigated the Ethiopian Orthodox claims about possessing the Ark of the Covenant? Elena's response came within 6 hours, which surprised me. Her replies usually took days, given the bureaucratic nature of Vatican communications. Alex, your inquiry has been noted and forwarded to the appropriate department. However, I must inform you that materials related to your specific request are currently under protocol relic restrictions. I cannot provide further information at this time. I would advise against pursuing this research direction. E. Rossi, Protocol Relic. I'd never heard the term before, and a quick internet search turned up nothing. No academic papers, no government documents, no casual references in religious forums. It was as if the phrase existed in a completely separate information ecosystem, one that normal researchers couldn't access. That afternoon, my hotel room phone rang. The caller ID showed only international with no number. Mr. Morrison. The voice was American, middle-aged, with the kind of neutral accent that comes from years of diplomatic training. Yes, my name is Cardinal Michael Toretti, Vatican Secretariat of State. I understand you've been making inquiries about certain historical artifacts currently held by our Ethiopian Orthodox colleagues. A cardinal calling me directly. In 31 years of life, I'd never been important enough to warrant attention from anyone higher than a district manager, and now I had a Vatican cardinal on the line. I'm a satellite imaging technician, I said carefully. I analyse ground-penetrating radar for geological surveys. Yes, we're aware of your professional background. We're also aware of your recent travel to Axum and your communication with Dr. Rossi. Mr. Morrison, I'm calling to advise you that you've stumbled into an area of inquiry that falls under Vatican security protocols. For your own safety, I strongly recommend that you discontinue this research and return to the United States immediately. My own safety? There are historical artifacts that were never meant to be disturbed, Mr. Morrison. Some knowledge carries a price that few are prepared to pay. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained certain guardianship responsibilities for nearly 3 millennia. That arrangement exists for the protection of all concerned parties. I could feel my heart racing, but I tried to keep my voice steady. What is Protocol Relic? There was a long pause. You're not cleared for that information, nor do you want to be. Take my advice, Mr. Morrison. Book the next flight home and forget whatever you think you've discovered in Axum. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The line went dead. I sat in my hotel room for a long time after that call, staring at the phone and trying to process what had just happened. A cardinal in the Vatican Secretariat of State, essentially the Catholic Church's Secretary of State, had called me personally to warn me away from my research. Not a local church official, not even a regional administrator, but someone at the very highest levels of Vatican hierarchy. Which meant the Catholic Church not only knew about the Ethiopian claims regarding the Ark, they were actively monitoring anyone who showed too much interest in investigating those claims. They had files on researchers, protocols for managing inquiries, and enough influence to track down a satellite technician in an Ethiopian hotel within hours of his asking the wrong questions. I thought about the Guardian's hollow eyes and his desperate warning, "You don't want what's inside." Maybe he wasn't just protecting the Ark from the world. Maybe he was protecting the world from the Ark. My laptop chimed with a new email notification. The sender was listed as E. Rossi, but the message was clearly not from Elena. Mr. Morrison, this will be my final communication on this matter. Protocol Relic is a Vatican security classification established in 1962 following certain discoveries made during the Second Vatican Council's review of sealed archives. Materials under this classification are restricted to a maximum of 12 individuals worldwide, all of whom hold positions equivalent to cardinal or higher within the Catholic hierarchy. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained custody of the artifact in question under a formal agreement dating to 1965. This agreement recognises Ethiopian sovereignty over the artefact in exchange for adherence to specific containment protocols established by a joint Vatican-Ethiopian commission. These protocols exist because the artefact exhibits properties that pose significant risks to regional stability when improperly handled or exposed. The Guardian tradition is not merely ceremonial, it serves a crucial containment function that has prevented numerous potential catastrophes over the past several decades. Your thermal analysis data has been reviewed by our technical staff. We are aware of the correlations you have identified. We are also aware of the artefact's increasing activity levels over the past 5 years. A joint Vatican-Ethiopian assessment team is currently evaluating options for enhanced containment measures. This communication will self-delete in 60 seconds. Do not attempt to copy or save this message. Return to the United States immediately and discontinue all research related to this matter. You have been warned twice. There will not be a third warning. I watched the message count down from 60 seconds, trying to memorize every word. When it reached 0, the email disappeared from my inbox as if it had never existed. But I'd learned what I needed to know. The Vatican knew about the thermal correlations with regional conflicts. They'd known for years, possibly decades, and they were worried enough about increasing activity levels to consider enhanced containment measures. The Ark of the Covenant was real, it was buried beneath the chapel in Axum, and it was becoming more dangerous. I needed to get that thermal data to someone who could do something about it, someone outside the Vatican's sphere of influence. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I opened my laptop and began typing up a detailed summary of everything I'd discovered. The satellite data, the thermal correlations with regional conflicts, the Vatican security protocols, the Guardian's warning. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record of what I'd found. Outside my hotel window, the ancient obelisks of Axum stood silhouetted against the Ethiopian night sky. Monuments to a civilization that had claimed to possess God's greatest gift to humanity. 12 feet below, a simple stone chapel. Something waited in the darkness, growing stronger, growing more active, preparing for something that would make the regional conflicts of the past 15 years look like minor skirmishes. And I was probably the only person outside the Vatican and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church who understood what was coming. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of booking a flight home like the Vatican had demanded, I drove the rental car to a cybercafe in Addis Ababa and uploaded a carefully edited version of my satellite data to Reddit. I chose the r/conspiracy subreddit because I knew it would get attention without being taken seriously by any official monitoring systems. The post was titled "Weird Thermal Anomaly Under Ethiopian Church." Anyone know what this could be? I included 3 of the clearer thermal images showing the heat signature beneath the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, along with GPS coordinates and a brief description of the geometric void. I deliberately left out any mention of the Ark, the Vatican communications, or the correlations with regional conflicts. To casual readers, it would look like a curious geological anomaly discovered by a satellite technician who was genuinely puzzled by what he'd found. The post got 17 comments in the first hour. Most were jokes about ancient aliens or government cover-ups, but a few showed genuine technical interest. One user with apparent geology credentials suggested underground geothermal activity. Another pointed out that the heat signature was too localized and too geometric to be natural. I was reading through the comments when my laptop screen went black. Not a normal shutdown or crash, but an instantaneous cut-off as if someone had yanked the power cord. Except the laptop was running on battery power and the charging light was still on. The screen stayed black for maybe 10 seconds, then flickered back to life showing the Windows startup sequence. When the system finished rebooting, my Reddit post was gone. Not deleted with a moderator message, not removed for violating community guidelines, but completely absent as if it had never existed. My browser history showed no record of visiting Reddit. The thermal images I'd uploaded weren't in my recent files folder. Someone had remotely accessed my laptop and scrubbed all evidence of the post, while leaving everything else untouched. I sat in the internet cafe for a long time, watching Ethiopian families use the other computers to video chat with relatives abroad and university students researching papers. Normal people living normal lives, oblivious to the fact that I'd just learned something terrifying about the reach and capabilities of whoever was monitoring research into the Axum artifact. They had hacked my laptop remotely, selectively deleted specific files, and removed all trace of my Reddit post within hours of its publication. This wasn't just Vatican influence or church pressure. This was signals intelligence, cyber warfare capabilities, the kind of resources that only major governments or international intelligence agencies could deploy. I paid for my computer time and walked back to the rental car, feeling like I was being watched even though the street looked perfectly normal. Addis Ababa traffic flowed around me with its usual chaotic energy. Buses packed with passengers, merchants pushing handcarts loaded with goods, children selling bottled water at red lights. But someone in that crowd could be monitoring me. Someone with access to satellite feeds and facial recognition software, and the authority to scrub information from major social media platforms in real time. That night, back in my hotel room in Axum, I made backup copies of all my remaining data and hid them in 3 different locations around the town. One encrypted drive taped under a restaurant table where I'd eaten dinner, another hidden in the base of an ancient obelisk in the archaeological park, the third buried in a plastic bag near a tree outside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, as close to the chapel as I could get without being seen. If they could hack my devices remotely, I needed analog backups they couldn't access digitally. The next morning I woke to find my hotel room door unlocked. I always use the deadbolt and chain lock, habits from years of business travel. But both were disengaged, and there was no sign of forced entry. My luggage had been searched with professional thoroughness. Everything returned to almost exactly its original position, but with tiny variations that proved someone had been through my belongings. My laptop was still there, apparently untouched. My cameras and field equipment were undisturbed, but the encrypted drive where I'd stored copies of the satellite data was missing from the hidden compartment in my suitcase. They'd taken only what they needed and left everything else to maintain the illusion that nothing had happened. Except they'd made one mistake. They'd unlocked the door when they left, probably to avoid the sound of manipulating the locks from inside. I was no longer just being monitored, I was being actively managed. I packed quickly and checked out of the hotel, telling the desk clerk I had a family emergency back in the United States. But instead of heading to the airport, I drove to the archaeological park and retrieved the data drive I'd hidden at the base of the obelisk. Sitting in the rental car with ancient stone monuments all around me, I made one final attempt to get the information out. I logged into an anonymous email account I'd created years earlier and composed a message to every major news organisation I could think of: CNN, BBC, Reuters, AP, the New York Times. The subject line was simple: evidence of active electromagnetic anomaly at claimed Ark of Covenant site in Ethiopia. In the body of the message I laid out everything: the satellite thermal data, the correlations with regional conflicts, the Vatican's protocol relic warnings, the cyber intrusion and hotel room search. I attached the clearest thermal images and GPS coordinates, along with a detailed timeline showing how the heat signature had intensified over 15 years. I hit send and watched the message appear in my outbox, then immediately start moving to the sent folder. Except it never arrived. I tried again with a different email service, then a third. Same result every time. The messages showed as sent from my end, but never reached their destinations. Someone was intercepting my communications at the internet service provider level, identifying and blocking any transmission that contained my satellite data or references to the Axum thermal anomaly. I was completely isolated, cut off from any normal channels of communication, surrounded by an electronic net that prevented me from sharing what I'd discovered. But I still had the physical drive hidden near the church, and I still had one option they couldn't control remotely. That afternoon, I walked to the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion compound and found a spot where I could observe the restricted chapel from a distance. Tourists and pilgrims moved through the public areas, taking photos and buying souvenirs. while the Guardian's building sat silent and forbidden behind its fence. I waited until late afternoon, when the crowds thinned and the light was beginning to fade. Then I walked casually toward the area where I'd buried the encrypted drive, as if I were just another tourist admiring the ancient architecture. The drive was gone. The plastic bag was still there, exactly where I'd buried it, but empty. They'd found my backup, extracted the data, and left the bag as a message. We know where you've been. We know what you've hidden. We can reach anything you think is secure. As I stood there staring at the empty bag, a shadow fell across the ground beside me. I looked up to see the Guardian standing at one of the chapel windows, his hollow eyes fixed on my face. But this time, he wasn't warning me away. He was nodding, almost imperceptibly, as if he approved of what I'd been trying to do. Then he pointed downward, toward the ground beneath my feet, and mouthed a single word I could read clearly even at 50 yards distance. Soon! I flew back to the United States the next day, but I never made it to my apartment in Denver. 2 men in dark suits were waiting for me at baggage claim, holding a sign with my name and looking like the kind of federal agents you see in movies. "Mr. Morrison, we're with the Department of Homeland Security. We need to speak with you about your recent travel activities." They escorted me to a windowless room in the airport's security section, where a third man was waiting with a thick folder and a digital recorder. "I'm Agent Phillips," the older man said. "We understand you've been conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering in Ethiopia, specifically related to sites of religious significance to our Ethiopian government partners. I'm a satellite imaging technician. I analyze geological data for mining and construction companies. We're aware of your professional background, Mr. Morrison. We're also aware that you've been making inquiries about classified materials with Vatican contacts, posting sensitive imagery to social media platforms, and attempting to contact media organizations with what you claim is evidence of electromagnetic anomalies at Ethiopian Orthodox Church sites. They knew everything. Not just my activities in Ethiopia, but my attempts to share the data, my communications with Elena Rossi, even my failed Reddit post. The thermal imagery you captured falls under the jurisdiction of several international agreements regarding the protection of cultural and religious sites," Phillips continued. "Specifically, it relates to a joint Vatican-Ethiopian cultural preservation protocol that supersedes normal academic or journalistic access. Cultural preservation protocol? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has requested that certain sites be protected from unauthorized analysis or exposure that might damage their religious significance or cultural integrity. The Vatican has agreed to help enforce these protections as part of ongoing interfaith cooperation initiatives. It was a lie, of course. They weren't protecting cultural sites. They were suppressing evidence of something that posed a much more serious threat. But I was sitting in a windowless room at the Denver airport with 3 federal agents, and my laptop had already demonstrated that normal channels of communication were compromised. "We're prepared to offer you a choice, Mr. Morrison," Phillips said. "You can sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding your recent research activities, accept reassignment to a different geographical focus area within your company, and continue your career with no further complications. Or we can discuss this matter with your employer, your security clearance sponsors, and potentially with federal prosecutors who take a very dim view of unauthorized intelligence activities in sensitive foreign locations." I stared at the folder on the table between us, thinking about the Guardian's hollow eyes and his final gesture toward the ground beneath the chapel. Thinking about 15 years of thermal data showing an ancient weapon growing stronger, more active, more dangerous. What happens if I signed? You return to your normal work assignments. You avoid any further research related to Ethiopian archaeological sites. You don't discuss your recent findings with colleagues, media contacts, or internet forums. In exchange, we ensure that your employer receives a positive assessment of your professionalism and discretion during this culturally sensitive assignment. And if I don't sign? Phillips opened the folder and showed me the first page. It was a letter from Orbital Dynamics' Human Resources Department, dated that morning, informing me that my employment had been terminated due to misuse of company resources for unauthorized personal research projects. "Your security clearance will be revoked," he continued. "Your access to government contracting databases will be permanently blocked, and we'll be sharing our assessment of your activities with other satellite imaging companies, geological survey firms, and any future employers who request background information. They were offering to destroy my career or let me pretend none of this had ever happened. But either way, the information I'd gathered would never reach anyone who could act on it. I thought about Cardinal Toretti's warning on the phone. Some knowledge carries a price that few are prepared to pay. Maybe this was the price. Professional destruction, isolation, the slow erasure of everything I'd worked to build over the past decade. I need time to think about it. You have until we finish processing your luggage, 20 minutes, maybe 30. 20 minutes to decide whether to sacrifice my career for information that no one would believe, no one could verify, and no one was allowed to investigate. I signed the non-disclosure agreement. They released me 2 hours later with a stern warning about the consequences of violating federal agreements, and a business card with a phone number I could call if I ever felt tempted to discuss my Ethiopian research with anyone. But they made one crucial mistake. They assumed I was the only person who had access to the satellite data. That night in my apartment in Denver, I opened my laptop and logged into Orbital Dynamics employee portal. My access had been suspended, as expected, but the system showed I was still listed as being on authorized leave for another 3 days. Someone had delayed updating my termination in the central database. I used those 3 days to access everything I could reach. Not just my own analysis files, but the complete archive of satellite coverage for the Horn of Africa going back to the company's founding. If the thermal anomaly beneath the Axum Chapel was increasing in intensity, there might be other sites showing similar patterns, other locations where ancient artifacts were responding to modern conflicts. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The Ark wasn't unique, it was part of a network. Thermal anomalies appeared at 17 different locations across the Middle East and North Africa, all buried beneath religious sites, all generating heat signatures that correlated with regional violence. A geometric void beneath the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Another under the Great Mosque of Mecca. Heat sources beneath Christian monasteries in Syria, Coptic churches in Egypt, ancient temples in Iraq. Every major conflict of the past 2 decades, the Iraq War, the Syrian Civil War, the Arab Spring, the ongoing violence in Yemen and Libya, correlated with intensified thermal activity at multiple sites, as if the artifacts were communicating with each other, coordinating their responses to human warfare. I copied everything I could access onto encrypted drives and mailed them to safety deposit boxes in 3 different states. Then I submitted my resignation from Orbital Dynamics, citing personal reasons, and disappeared. For 3 weeks I lived in cheap motels and paid for everything with cash, moving from city to city while I tried to figure out what to do with what I'd learned. The thermal network wasn't just evidence of ancient technology, it was evidence of an active weapons system that had been influencing human conflict for millennia. A weapons system that was becoming more coordinated, more responsive, more powerful. On a Tuesday morning in Salt Lake City, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Elena Rossi. "Alex, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Elena, I thought you were under Vatican restrictions. I'm calling from a secure line. Listen carefully. Something has happened. The Ethiopian government has sealed off the entire Axum region. No flights in or out, no ground access, complete media blackout. They're claiming it's a military exercise, but my sources inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church say it's something else." "What kind of something else?" "The Guardian is dead, Alex. He died 3 days ago. And when they went to choose his replacement, they found the chapel empty. Whatever was buried beneath the church, it's gone." I felt the blood drain from my face. Gone how? No one knows. The Ethiopian military is conducting a grid search of the entire region, but there's no sign of forced entry, no evidence of excavation, no indication that anyone broke into the chapel. The artifact simply left. That's impossible. Satellite thermal imaging shows massive energy spikes at 17 locations across the Middle East and North Africa, all occurring within a 6-hour window starting with the Guardian's death. The Vatican has activated something called the Omega Protocol, and they're requesting immediate assistance from the United States, Russia and China. The Omega Protocol. I'd never heard the term before, but I could guess what it meant. The final contingency, the last resort when all other containment measures had failed. "Eleanor, where are you calling from?" "I'm at a monastery in Switzerland. The Vatican has evacuated all protocol relic personnel to secure locations. They're expecting the worst." "What's the worst?" "According to the sealed archives, the last time the artifacts were fully active was during the Crusades. The entire geopolitical structure of 3 continents collapsed within a century. Empires fell, entire populations migrated, technological development stalled for 500 years. I thought about the thermal data I'd collected, the correlations between artifact activity and regional violence. If the Ark and its companion devices were no longer contained, no longer isolated in buried chambers beneath ancient churches, what would happen to the world? "Alex, are you still there?" "Yeah." "Eleanor, I need you to do something. I'm going to send you coordinates for safety deposit boxes in Phoenix, Dallas, and Atlanta. Inside each box is a complete archive of satellite data showing the thermal network. If something happens to me, make sure that information reaches someone who can act on it." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find the Ark. The line went dead." That afternoon I bought a plane ticket to Ethiopia under a false name, using identity documents I'd acquired during my weeks of hiding. If the Ethiopian government had sealed off the Axum region, I'd have to find another way in, but I was probably the only person outside government and religious authorities who understood the scope of what was happening. The only person who might be able to track down a 3,000-year-old weapon that had just escaped from its prison and was preparing to reshape human civilization. I'm writing this from a cabin in the mountains of western Montana, 6 months after the Axum incident. The official story is that a localized seismic event damaged several ancient structures in northern Ethiopia, requiring temporary military restrictions while archaeological assessment teams evaluate the cultural heritage impact. The real story is that 17 ancient weapons have vanished from their containment sites across 3 continents, leaving behind nothing but empty chambers and the withered corpses of their guardians. The thermal network I discovered through satellite analysis was just the visible symptom of something much older and more complex. For 3 millennia, objects of immense power had been sleeping beneath humanity's most sacred sites, occasionally stirring in response to nearby conflicts, but generally remaining dormant under the watch of religious orders that had forgotten why they were really guarding empty rooms. Now they're awake, active and loose in a world with 7 billion people, and enough weapons to destroy civilization a dozen times over. Elena kept her promise and distributed copies of my satellite archive to researchers at major universities, intelligence agencies, and international organizations. Most dismissed the data as elaborate hoax or misinterpreted sensor readings. A few took it seriously enough to begin their own investigations, only to discover that every relevant database had been scrubbed. Every supporting document had vanished. Every potential witness had signed binding non-disclosure agreements. But I know the truth is spreading, filtering through the kind of networks that governments can't completely control. Academic conferences where researchers share suspicions in private conversations. Intelligence analysts who notice patterns their superiors don't want them to report. Military officers who track unexplained energy signatures and find their requests for investigation quietly denied. The world is changing, and most people don't realize it yet. Regional conflicts that should burn out quickly are intensifying instead. Ancient ethnic tensions are flaring into violence across Africa and the Middle East. Political movements that seemed stable are fracturing along religious lines. The artifacts aren't causing the conflicts. Humans are perfectly capable of finding reasons to fight each other, but they're amplifying existing tensions, feeding on the emotional energy of warfare and using that power to grow stronger, more coordinated, more influential. I've been tracking their movements through news reports, social media posts, and amateur satellite imagery, shared on forums that haven't been scrubbed yet. Heat signatures appearing in conflict zones days before major battles. Unexplained electromagnetic anomalies detected near military bases. Reports of ancient artifacts being discovered by various armed groups, then quickly disappearing again. They're not random. They're following a pattern, positioning themselves to influence key events, preparing for something bigger than individual regional conflicts. Last week I received an encrypted message through a routing system so complex I couldn't trace its origin. The text was simple. The covenant was not meant for one people or one place. It was meant for all people, all places when the time was ready. The time is now ready. Choose wisely. Choose wisely, as if I have a choice in whatever's coming. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the real power of these artifacts isn't their ability to influence events, but their ability to force people to make choices they wouldn't otherwise have to make. The Guardian in Axum spent decades watching over something that was slowly killing him, but he chose to stay, chose to maintain the containment protocols, chose to warn me away from dangers I didn't understand. Now it's my turn to choose. I could destroy this account, burn the remaining evidence, disappear completely into a life where none of this ever happened. Or I can keep tracking the artifacts, documenting their movements, building a record of what's really happening as the world stumbles towards some kind of transformation it doesn't see coming. The cabin where I'm staying sits on 40 acres of isolated mountain forest, far from cities and conflict zones, and the electromagnetic networks that seem to attract the artifact's attention. But even here, on clear nights, I can see strange lights moving across the sky. Not aircraft, not satellites, but something else entirely, following patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. They're out there, 17 pieces of ancient technology that were designed to reshape civilizations, and they're working together now, coordinating their efforts, preparing for something that will make the fall of empires look like minor historical footnotes. I have 3 more encrypted drives hidden in various locations around the country, each containing copies of everything I've learned about the thermal network and the artifact sites. If you're reading this, it means something happened to me, and Elena Rossi or one of the other researchers I contacted managed to get this information published despite whatever security measures are in place to prevent it. Don't dismiss this as conspiracy theory or elaborate fiction. Check the satellite data yourself if you have access. Look for thermal anomalies beneath major religious sites. Track the correlations between unexplained energy signatures and regional conflicts. Pay attention to news reports of ancient artifacts being discovered and then quickly classified or removed by authorities. The pattern is there if you know how to look for it. The Ark of the Covenant was never lost. It was never just sitting passively in some forgotten chamber, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists or treasure hunters. It was sleeping, along with its companion devices, under the protection of guardians who understood that some powers are too dangerous for humanity to wield. Now it's awake, and it's not alone, and it's preparing to fulfill whatever purpose it was originally designed for 3,000 years ago. The only question is whether we'll be ready for what comes next. I hope this account reaches people who can do something with the information, people with resources and influence, and the courage to investigate what most would rather ignore. But even if it doesn't, even if this becomes just another conspiracy theory lost in the noise of the internet, at least there will be a record of what one satellite technician discovered when he looked too closely at the wrong thermal signature. The Ark Protocol is active, the Covenant has been renewed, and somewhere in the darkness between the ancient and the modern, 17 pieces of divine technology are preparing to reshape the world according to plans that were set in motion before human civilization began. Choose wisely. Alex Morrison, December 2024.